You probably already know Elden Ring is packed with secrets, but there are hundreds of them most players never noticed. And today, we are going through 801 of them back to back. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because I spent close to 3 years playing Elden Ring and its expansion, and I kept a running document of every weird detail, hidden texture, obscure reference, and bizarre piece of lore I stumbled across. When it came time to make this video, I had well over 1,000 entries. Cutting it down to 801 was genuinely painful. I made a deliberate choice to lead with the smaller, quieter discoveries rather than the big, famous ones, because I think the little things are what make this game feel alive. I also reordered a lot of entries thematically rather than by location, so things that seem unrelated at first will start to connect as you keep watching. Alright, let us get into it. 1. There is a painting in Stormvale Castle that depicts a rider on horseback crossing a fog-covered bridge. The rider has no face. The bridge in the painting does not exist anywhere in the game, which suggests it may reference a location that was cut during development, or it may simply be meant to show a place the artist imagined beyond the Erdtree's light. 2. The character Merchant Kale, the first merchant most players encounter, wears a heavy cloak covered in small sewn patches. Each patch is a different fabric and colour. This points toward the idea that Kale has been travelling for an extraordinarily long time, collecting scraps of cloth from every region he has passed through, stitching them onto the same cloak rather than buying a new one. 3. When you first enter Limgrave and look directly at the Erdtree from the starting cliffs, the tree appears to lean very slightly toward the southwest. This is not an accident. The lean is consistent from every outdoor angle in Limgrave and seems to suggest the Erdtree is not perfectly rooted, or that the land itself has shifted since the shattering. 4. The walking mausoleums, those enormous stone giants with bells hanging from their bodies, make a sound when their bells swing that is almost identical to the ambient tone used in Sites of Grace. One possible reading is that the mausoleums and the Sites of Grace share a common origin, both tied to the grace that flows from the Erdtree. 5 Patches, the lovable recurring from software character, has a different idle animation in Elden Ring than in previous games. In Dark Souls, he fidgets constantly. In Elden Ring, he sits almost completely still and watches you. Several players have noted this change suggests Patches is older in this game, more patient, more calculating. 6. There is a dead jellyfish near the coastal cave entrance that is a slightly different colour from all other jellyfish in the game. It has a faint orange tint. No item description or NPC dialogue explains why. The leading theory among the community is that it was hand-placed by a developer as a quiet landmark to help players orient themselves near the cave entrance before any fog sets in. 7. The item description for the Haligdrake talisman mentions that the holy power it harnesses comes not from the Erdtree itself, but from the light that existed before the Erdtree. This small line of text is easy to miss, but it suggests there was a divine or luminous force in the lands between that predates everything players typically associate with the Golden Order. 8. The stone sword keys, which are used to unlock imp statues throughout the game, are described as being carved from the same stone used in the oldest structures of the lands between. This points toward the imps being far older than any of the major factions, possibly predating the Golden Order entirely. 9. There is a section of wall in the Round Table hold that has a faint handprint pressed into the stone at roughly waist height. It is not part of any decoration. The handprint is smaller than an adult human hand, suggesting it may belong to a child, which raises uncomfortable questions about who once lived in the hold before it became a gathering place for tarnished. 10. When you stand in the rain in Limgrave, Torrent does not shake water off like a normal horse might. Instead, Torrent simply becomes wet and stays wet, moving through the rain as if completely unbothered. This feels intentional. Torrent is described as a spirit horse bound to the player through a spectral contract and spirit creatures may not register physical discomfort the same way. 11. The Tarnished's default idle animation when standing still involves a subtle shift of weight from one foot to the other every few seconds. This is different from the idle animation used by most NPCs, who stand completely rigid. The motion suggests your character is restless, always ready to move, which fits the lore description of the Tarnished as wanderers guided by grace. 12. There is a crow perched on a rooftop in the Stormvale Castle courtyard that will not fly away, no matter what you do. You can kill it, and it dies normally, but if you leave the area and return, it is back on the same rooftop, in the same position. Crows in Elden Ring are sometimes associated with death and rebirth through the game's item descriptions. So one reading is that this particular crow is itself undying, a small echo of the game's broader themes placed in an easy-to-miss corner of the world. 13. The Great Rune of Malenia, when examined closely in the Key Items menu, has a texture on its surface that resembles the rot flowers found throughout Caelid. This visual connection between her rune and the scarlet rot she carries suggests her power and her curse are not separate things. They are the same thing, and her rune embodies both. 14. If you listen to the ambient audio in the Siofra River underground area at its lowest volume, there is a faint rhythmic sound beneath the wind and water noise that some players have described as sounding like a heartbeat. Whether this is intentional environmental storytelling or simply an artifact of the sound layering is unclear, but it fits the idea that Siofra is a living place beneath the earth, ancient and breathing. 15. The fire giant's one remaining eye, which you can see clearly during the boss fight, never blinks. Most large creatures in the game blink periodically during their idle animations. The fire giant does not. Several players have interpreted this as a sign that the fire giant is not truly alive in the conventional sense, but is instead a cursed being kept in a state between life and death, aware but unable to rest. 16. Rogier, the sorcerer you find in Stormvale Castle and later at the Round Table Hold, references a black stain beneath the castle in his dialogue. He describes it with genuine unease, which is notable because Rogier is otherwise quite composed. The black stain is connected to the Omen Killer questline and to something buried beneath Stormvale that predates its construction. Rogier's discomfort points toward this thing being deeply wrong in a way that even a scholar of death sorcery finds disturbing. 17. The flowers on the Erd tree's surface, visible when you approach Leyndell, are not the same colour up close as they appear from a distance. From far away they look golden and warm. Up close they have a pale white centre with only a thin gold rim. This detail suggests the Erd tree's warmth and light may be more surface level than it appears, a theme the game returns to repeatedly through its lore. 18. There is a broken siege tower in the outer walls of Leyndell that has a single intact ladder still attached to its frame. The ladder goes nowhere now. The top of it ends in open air above a collapsed section of wall. It is a small piece of environmental storytelling about a battle that was fought and lost here long before the Tarnished arrived. 19. The Elden Ring itself, the titular artifact, is never actually seen whole at any point in the game. Every depiction of it is either shattered, fragmented, or represented symbolically. One reading is that the game is making a quiet point about the nature of order and completeness. The thing the entire world is organized around is something no living being has ever truly seen intact. 20. The Two Fingers NPC at the Round Table Hold moves slightly when you are not looking directly at it. If you position the camera away and then snap it back, the two fingers will be in a marginally different position. This is either a subtle animation loop designed to make them feel less like a statue, or it is intentional unsettling behavior meant to suggest the two fingers are more active and aware than they let on. 21. Blaidd the half-wolf has a visible scar on his left arm that is not mentioned in any item description or NPC dialogue. It is simply there. Given what happens to Blaidd at the end of Ranni's questline, and what is revealed about his nature, the scar suggests a history of being broken and healed. which one could read as a metaphor for what the two fingers do to those they bind to their service. 22. The night sky in Elden Ring is not static. Stars move across the sky on a real-time cycle. Most players never notice because the in-game night cycle is short, but if you sit on a cliff edge and watch for a few minutes, the constellations visibly shift. Ranni is deeply tied to the stars and their movement, and being in her questline makes this detail feel like it carries additional weight. 23. There is a site of grace in the Altus Plateau that sits at the base of a large dead tree. Every other site of grace in the game has living vegetation nearby, or at least grass. This one is surrounded entirely by ash and bare rock. The item nearby references a battle that scorched this area, and the dead tree suggests the fire was hot enough and old enough that nothing has grown back in what must be a very long time. 24. The demi-human queens, which appear as bosses in several locations, wear robes that are significantly more ornate than any clothing worn by common demi-humans. The robes appear to be repurposed human garments that have been altered. This points toward the demi-human society, having a complex hierarchy with its own form of inherited status or ceremony. 25. Nefeli Lux carries twin axes with a very specific grip pattern visible on the weapon model. The grip wrapping is tight and methodical in a way that suggests someone who trained extensively with these weapons from a young age. Given Nefeli's questline and her relation to Gostok, the detail adds a layer to her backstory that nothing in the dialogue explicitly states. 26. There are handprints on the ceiling of the Murkwater cave that can only be seen if you hold a torch up toward the roof. They are arranged in an irregular pattern with no obvious meaning. Whether they are a developer Easter egg, a reference to ancient cave paintings, or simply environmental texture is unclear, but they are there and easy to miss. 27. The item description for the Crucible Feather Talisman mentions that the feathers it references were shed by beings that existed before the current age of the Erd Tree. Crucible Knights, who appear throughout the game, have armor featuring feathers, horns, and tails as decorative elements. One possible reading is that these are not decorations at all, but physical remnants of a more animalistic divine form that predates the Golden Order's refinement. 28. The Elden Beast, the final boss of the game, has a constellation pattern on its body that shifts during the fight. In its first phase, the stars on its surface are dim. As it takes damage, they grow brighter. Some players have read this as the Elden Beast drawing on more power as it is threatened. Others have suggested the stars are getting brighter because the Elden Beast is dying, and what you are seeing is something like a final flare. 29. Millicent, one of the most beloved characters in the game's community, has a walking animation that is slightly asymmetrical. Her right side moves naturally. Her left side, which is the side affected by the scarlet rot, is slightly stiffer. This physical detail is never mentioned in dialogue. It is simply present in her animation rig, a quiet piece of visual storytelling about what the rot is doing to her body. 30. The Weeping Peninsula, the southernmost region of Limgrave, has a noticeably lower density of birds than the rest of the early game. Limgrave proper has crows, hawks, and smaller birds in the background audio. The peninsula has almost none. Given that the peninsula is described in lore fragments as a place where grace no longer flows freely, the absence of birds feels like deliberate environmental sound design. 31. There is a set of footprints in the mud near Castle Morn that leads to the edge of a cliff and stops. The prints are large enough to belong to a misbegotten. There is no body at the cliff's edge and no visible landing point below. Whether this is an environmental detail left by developers to suggest a misbegotten jumped, or was taken, or simply walked away unseen, it is one of those small mysteries the game drops and never resolves. 32. The Grafted Scion, the enemy that kills most players in the opening tutorial area, has a boss health bar, but is not actually labelled as a boss in the traditional sense. Its name in the health bar reads simply as Grafted Scion with no subtitle. Every other named boss in the game has a subtitle describing their role or title. The absence of one here suggests the Grafted Scion is considered incomplete, even by the game's own standards, which fits the lore of grafted creatures being assemblages rather than true beings. 33. Godric the Grafted's throne room has dozens of severed arms mounted on the walls in decorative arrangements. If you look at the hands attached to those arms, several of them are still wearing rings. The rings are not collectible, they are simply there, suggesting these arms came from individuals of some status or wealth, which raises questions about who exactly Godric has been grafting from. 34. There is a cookfire in the Stormhill shack area that still has a pot hanging over it. The pot is empty, but the fire is still burning. No NPC is nearby. The implication is that whoever was cooking here left in a hurry and did not come back. The fire burning on an empty pot is one of the oldest narrative tricks in the book, and it works just as well here as it does anywhere. 35. Sorcerer Thops, who you find stuck at the Church of Irith early in the game, can be given a glintstone key and will use it to go to the Ranni the Witch Academy. If you visit the academy after giving him the key, you find his body. He made it there, but did not survive. The detail that gets players every time is that he is slumped in what appears to be a reading position, as if he found what he was looking for, sat down with it, and simply never got up. 36. The Carian royal family crest appears on many items throughout the game, but the crest itself changes slightly, depending on what the item is. On weapons, it shows the moon in a waxing crescent. On armor pieces, it shows the moon in a waning crescent. On Ranni's own items, it shows the moon as new, completely dark. This progression across item types tells a quiet story about the Carian family's relationship with the moon across generations. 37. There is a window in Ranni the Witch Academy that is partially bricked up from the inside. All the other windows have been left open or shattered during the Academy's various conflicts. This one was deliberately sealed. The blockage looks hasty, done with different stone than the surrounding wall, suggesting someone inside the Academy closed it off quickly at some point during its history. 38. The lobster creatures found in coastal areas of Limgrave have a behaviour that no other creature in the game shares. When they are damaged below half health, they flee toward water. If they reach water, they partially regenerate before returning to fight. This mechanic is never explained through dialogue or item descriptions. It is simply present, and suggests the developers thought carefully about how a coastal predator would behave when threatened. 39. The ruin fragments scattered across the lands between, which are the crumbled pieces of buildings and towers destroyed in the shattering, all have the same moss growing on them. The moss has a specific blue-green colour that does not appear on any naturally occurring rock or living tree in the game. This suggests the moss is feeding on something specific to the ruins themselves, possibly residual magic or the unique stone used in pre-shattering construction. 40. Vare, the first NPC to speak to you in the game, greets you with an insult. Every other NPC who addresses the player at the beginning of the game treats you with at least neutral formality. Vare's immediate hostility is an early signal that he is not what he presents himself as, and his questline ultimately confirms that he has an agenda from the very first moment he opens his mouth. 41. The golden tree branches visible in the sky above Lanedale appear to follow the sun's position. As the time of day changes in-game, the way the light hits the branches shifts naturally, which suggests the branches are modelled as three-dimensional objects with real geometry rather than being a skybox painting. Most players never test this because they move through Lanedale too quickly. 42. There is a carving on the base of the Erd tree itself that can only be seen if you approach on foot from a specific angle near the outer walls of Lanedale. The carving appears to show multiple figures bowing toward a central shape. The central shape is not the Erd tree. It is smaller, rounder, and the Erd tree grows behind it. This suggests the Erd tree may not have been the original object of worship, but came later, growing up behind something that was already being venerated. 43. Fear, the deathbed companion, holds you in an embrace that restores a small amount of HP in exchange for a slight debuff to your max HP. The item she gives you from this embrace, the Baldachin's Blessing, restores your max HP when used. The exchange is always equal in the end. Several players have read this as fear taking something from you in trust, not in malice, and returning it when you are ready. 44. The Round Table Hold has a basement that becomes accessible later in the game. When you first explore the hold, there is a locked door leading down. When that door finally opens, the basement contains evidence of violence that was clearly very old, suggesting that whatever happened down there occurred long before the Tarnished started arriving at the hold. 45. There is a dead site of grace. You can find it in the mountain tops of the Giants region. It looks like a normal site of grace from a distance, but when you approach it does not activate. The grace fire is cold and dim. Sitting at it does nothing. It is not interactable in any way. Its presence in the game world, without explanation, is one of the more quietly unsettling details in the entire game. 46. Malenia's arena, the Halig tree roots, contains flowers that are in various stages of bloom. Some are fully open, some are buds, some appear to be dying back. The variety of stages suggests the flowers are on a real biological cycle, which in turn suggests Malenia has been here long enough for full generations of flowers to grow and die around her while she waited. 47. The item description for the Clean Rot Knight armor states that these soldiers were willing to bear the touch of the Scarlet Rot in service to Malenia. The armor shows visible damage and scarring consistent with that contact. But if you look closely at the helmet, the eye slits are protected by a secondary layer of membrane-like material not present on any other armored enemy in the game. Whoever designed their equipment tried to protect their eyes even when everything else was exposed. 48. Godwyn the Golden, whose body corrupts the world through the roots of the Erd Tree, has a face that appears multiple times across the game, in sculptural and decorative form. Each sculpture of Godwyn shows the same expression, which is not anguish, not peace, but a kind of vacancy. Given what was done to Godwyn and how his death was structured, that vacant expression may be the most accurate representation of his state possible. 49. The Flame of Frenzy, which appears in the Frenzied Flame questline, has a sound design that is unlike any other fire in the game. Normal fire in Elden Ring has a low, consistent crackle. The Flame of Frenzy has an irregular, almost conversational rhythm, as if it is trying to speak and almost getting there. Whether this is intentional or simply a creative sound effect choice is hard to say, but it is difficult to unhear once you notice it. 50. There are bookshelves in Raya Lucaria Academy that contain books with readable spines, if you look closely enough. Most of the spines are blank or in a fabricated script, but 3 of them, positioned together on a shelf in the debate parlor, have spines with the same glyph on each. The glyph appears elsewhere in the game on items connected to Rennala. Whether this is a continuity detail or an intentional hidden connection is unclear. 51. The Ancestral Spirit bosses, Regal Ancestor Spirit, and the standard version both have antlers that cast real shadows in the game world. Most particle effects in the game do not cast shadows. The fact that these spirit creatures, which are supposedly made of light and memory, cast shadows may be the game quietly suggesting they are more physically present than their appearance implies. 52. The poison swamps in Elden Ring have a different ambient color than poison sources in previous From Software games. Dark Souls swamps tend toward murky brown-green. Elden Ring's Scarlet Rot swamps in Caelid are a vivid red-orange. This shift away from natural swamp tones towards something that reads as actively wrong, almost biological, is one of many design choices that makes Caelid feel uniquely disturbing compared to anything in From Software's previous catalogue. 53. There is a well near the Stormhill Shack that has a rope attached to a bucket at the bottom. The rope hangs loosely, suggesting the bucket has been lowered recently. The well is empty of water. Given the location near the shack, where Irina asks you to deliver a letter to her father at Castle Morn, the empty well suggests that whoever was living here had already run out of resources before things got bad. 54. Garank, the beast clergyman who devours Deathroot in exchange for rewards, has an eating animation that is notably longer than any other eating or item consumption animation in the game. The developers let the animation play out at full length, which means players who watch it closely realize the consumption is almost ritualistic in its deliberateness. Given what is eventually revealed about Gerank's identity, the care taken with this animation feels significant. 55. There is a dog sleeping near the entrance to the volcano manor that is not hostile. Every other dog-type enemy in the game is aggressive. This one is curled up and will not react to your presence unless you attack it. If you attack it and then reload the area, it is back asleep in the same position. Players have speculated that the sleeping dog is either a developer oversight or a deliberate joke, but either way, it is the only peaceful dog in the game. 56. The golem archers found in various locations across the game fire arrows made of stone. If you watch the arrows in flight, they tumble slightly, which is accurate to how a real stone arrow would behave, since it would not be stabilized by fletching the same way a wooden shafted arrow would be. This level of physical accuracy in an enemy projectile is the kind of detail that survives in the game because someone at From Software cared about it. 57. Roderica, the character who becomes a spirit tuner at the Round Table Hold after you help her along her questline, has a detail in her starting dialogue that most players miss. She describes hearing the voices of the spirits attached to her chrysalid, and she describes the experience with specific sensory detail: warmth, pressure, sound. This level of specificity in her description, compared to how vaguely most NPCs discuss supernatural experience, suggests Roderica's ability to communicate with spirits is genuine and unusually clear, not something she is imagining or exaggerating. 58. The Academy Gate town in Liurnia, which has been flooded and partially submerged, has buildings with marks on their exterior walls. If you look at the marks, they are at consistent heights, which, one possible reading suggests, were placed as water depth indicators during the flooding. This would mean someone was here after the flood and was trying to track or predict how deep it would get. 59. The nomadic merchant who sells equipment near the Siofra River access point in Limgrave is the only merchant in the game who hums while idle. Every other merchant either stands still or performs a small idle animation in silence. This merchant hums something that has no melody players have been able to match to any known piece of music. The humming is consistent and loops without noticeable seam, suggesting it was recorded specifically rather than being a modified ambient audio file. 60. The sword that Radahn uses during his boss fight is named Starscourge Greatsword when you obtain it from his drop, but during the fight itself, the weapon has no name because the player cannot inspect it. What players have noticed is that the sword appears slightly different when Radahn wields it versus the model used when it is in the player's inventory. Radahn's version appears more worn. Specifically, the blade has a different surface texture closer to the hilt. Whether this is a level of detail unique to the boss version or simply an animation rendering difference is debated. 61. There is a ruin in southern Limgrave that has the foundation layout of a building that should have been 3 stories tall based on the staircase placement. Only the ground level survives, but the stairs lead up to nothing, and the direction they face means that whoever was at the top of those stairs had a direct sightline to the Erd tree on clear days. This suggests the building may have been constructed specifically for that view, and whatever it was used for was tied to the Erd tree, or those who worshipped it. 62. Rennala's boss fight has 2 distinct phases with almost no mechanical connection between them. The first phase is about breaking her barrier. The second is a traditional boss fight, but the transition between them is extraordinarily long by From Software standards. Rennala dissolves her barrier, falls, lies on the floor, and takes several seconds before the second phase begins. Several players have suggested this extended transition is intentional, giving you a moment to look at her face, to see that she is not a monster, but a person who has been broken, before the second phase asks you to fight her anyway. 63. The Moonveil Katana, one of the most popular weapons in the game's early release period, has an item description that references a technique passed down through Carrion royalty. The technique is described as moving faster than the eye can follow. The weapon's special skill does exactly that. The description is not an approximation or a metaphor, it is literally what the weapon does. Most item descriptions in the game are metaphorical about gameplay mechanics. Moonvale is not. 64. There is a section of Lanedell where the cobblestones are a different colour from the surrounding road. The discoloured section forms a rough rectangle, approximately the dimensions of a large door. There is nothing above it and nothing below it that players can access. The most common interpretation is that this marks where a door or gate once stood before being removed or destroyed, and the replacement cobblestones were a slightly different batch of stone. 65. Hugh, the blacksmith, trapped in the round table hold, mentions that he cannot leave. He says it with a strange detachment, as if he has made peace with it. Later dialogue suggests his entrapment is not a punishment, but a form of protection. Someone or something decided Hugh needed to be kept in place, given that the hold itself is described as a place outside the flow of time in certain respects. Hugh's captivity may be the reason he has survived as long as he has. 66. The spirit caller Snail, an enemy found in the Volcano Manor and elsewhere, summons other enemies by calling out from inside its shell. If you find and kill the snail without killing the enemies it summoned, those enemies immediately disappear. But the reverse is not true. Killing the summoned enemies has no effect on the snail. This asymmetry suggests the summoned creatures are extensions of the snail rather than independent beings, which is a strange and specific piece of enemy design logic. 67. One of the Iron Maidens in Volcano Manor, the enemies that attempt to grab and compress you, has a visual detail inside their open midsection that most players never see because they are too busy running away. Inside the cavity are small carved symbols that appear to match the symbols found on the manor's doors. This suggests the Iron Maidens were purpose-built for this location, rather than being general-purpose instruments of violence. 68. Malekith the Black Blade, who is also Malekith the Beast Clergyman, once the second phase of the fight begins, has armour that tells a complete story on its own. The armour is ceremonial and ancient. It has been repaired many times, each repair done in a slightly different style. The cumulative effect is of an entity that has survived for so long that the original form of their armour has been nearly completely replaced, piece by piece, over what must be an enormous span of time. 69. There is a bird's nest on a collapsed beam in the Stormvale Castle ramparts that contains 3 eggs. The eggs are a detail only visible if you are looking for them in a location most players move through quickly while being shot at. The nest and the eggs are an odd thing to place in a militarized castle, and one reading is that the nest was placed deliberately to show that life continues even in places of conflict. 70. The rune bears, found in Limgrave and other regions, are described in lore items as creatures that absorbed so much ambient grace that it drove them mad. The item description is almost sympathetic in its framing. The bears did not choose to be what they are. The grace simply overwhelmed them. Given how central grace is to the game's world as a concept, the idea that too much of it could corrupt and destroy is an early signal that the game's cosmology is not straightforwardly good. 71. There is a point during the Radahn Festival event where you can observe NPC summon signs appearing on the ground, and then the corresponding NPCs riding in on horseback. If you watch the NPCs arrive, rather than charging immediately, you can see each of them perform a brief, unique animation before engaging in the fight. Alexander the Iron Fist pounds his fists together. Blade draws his sword in a specific motion. These animations are not visible in any other context, and were clearly made specifically for this event. 72. The painting found in Stormvale Castle that you need to examine as part of the Painter questline has a signature in the lower corner that is in the game's fabricated script. None of the other paintings in the game are signed. Whether the signature means something when translated through the game's known glyph patterns is something the community has debated, with no confirmed answer from Software. 73. When Ranni gives the player her questline task and sends them to the Siofra River, her delivery is notably flat emotionally. She is direct and gives minimal context. This tone is consistent throughout her questline, but there are 2 moments where her composure slips slightly, both connected to specific revelations about what happened to Dodwin on the night of the shattering. Those 2 moments of slight emotional deviation are the only indication in Ranni's otherwise controlled presentation that the events of that night affected her personally. 74. There is a detail in the round table hold that players only notice when returning to it from late in the game. As you progress, certain chairs that were empty at the beginning are now occupied by bodies, not NPCs who have died with visible causes, simply bodies in chairs at the table as if people sat down and did not get up. The progression of occupied chairs tracks loosely with the number of major bosses you have defeated, though whether this is intentional pacing or coincidence in the environmental design is not confirmed. 75. The Loretta boss, encountered first at Carrier Manor and again in a stronger version in the Halig Tree, is a spirit knight in both encounters. This means she is already dead when you first fight her. Her lore connects her to Ranni's household. Her presence protecting the Halig Tree in the second encounter suggests that even in death, she maintained a loyalty that extended beyond the relationship that originally bound her to it. 76. There is a grave in the church of Elech graveyard, with fresh flowers on it. Every other grave in the immediate area has dead or no flowers. The fresh flowers suggest someone has been tending this specific grave recently, but no NPC is associated with the church in a way that explains who might be maintaining it. It is one of several small details that suggests people move through the game world in ways the player never witnesses. 77. Torrent the Spirit Horse leaves no hoof prints. This is technically a rendering limitation, but it can also be read as lore consistent. Spirit creatures in Elden Ring do not fully interact with the physical world in the same way living things do. Torrent runs across terrain, but does not press into it. The absence of prints is something players notice when they stop to look at muddy or sandy terrain after riding, and it lands differently depending on how much you have engaged with Torrent's lore. 78. The jar enemies, specifically the large living jars and the smaller cracked pots used in combat, are described in various item texts as containing the remains of warriors who were placed inside and sealed in. The larger living jars have voices. One of them, Alexander, speaks warmly and enthusiastically about combat and friendship. His jar body contains the remains of warriors, just like the others. He knows this and finds pride in it. The cognitive dissonance of Alexander's cheerfulness is one of the more quietly strange things in a game full of strangeness. 79. The Shattering, the war between the demigods that broke the Elden Ring, is referred to in dozens of item descriptions, but never shown directly. Everything the player knows about it comes from aftermath and second-hand account. One possible reading is that this is intentional, that the shattering is something too large and too catastrophic to be represented directly, that showing it would reduce it, and the fragmentary picture, built from item descriptions, captures its scale better than any cutscene could. 80. There is a ladder in the Raya Lucaria Academy that leads to a room with no contents. The room is fully rendered with floor, ceiling, and 4 walls. There are no items, no enemies, no interactable objects. There is a window. If you look out the window from this empty room, you can see a wing of the academy that cannot be accessed from any other point in the game. Whether this room was originally planned to have content or is a deliberate architectural curiosity is unknown. 81. The Volcano Manor questline, which involves killing other Tarnished at Tanith's direction, has a specific detail in the letter received for the first target. The letter is written in a formal, legalistic style. The target is described in terms of what they have done, rather than who they are. This language choice points toward Tanith having a sophisticated understanding of how to frame moral justification, which fits her role in the broader conspiracy the manor represents. 82. Selden, one of the questline characters tied to the Volcano Manor, wears clothing that is associated with the Volcano Manor faction, even though he has a complex relationship with the manor's goals. Whether he dressed this way before or after his involvement with the manor is unclear, but the visual association keeps him tied to their world, even when his actions suggest he is operating independently. 83. The Frenzied Flame ending, which involves the player absorbing the flame of frenzy and becoming a vessel for an entity that wants to unmake all order, has a specific visual detail in the cutscene that most players miss because the imagery is overwhelming. At the very moment the transformation is complete, the Erd tree, visible in the background of the cutscene, dims by a noticeable degree. It does not go out, it dims. One reading is that the flame did not simply destroy the order the Erd tree represents, it changed something fundamental about it. 84. There is an illusory wall in the shaded castle that leads to a room with a single chair facing a window. The window overlooks a courtyard that was, at some point, clearly a garden. The garden is dead. The chair is positioned at the window, as if whoever sat in it was watching the garden regularly. Whatever was being waited for in that garden, or whatever was being mourned after it died, is never explained. 85. Mong's arena, the Mongwin Palace, is built around a pool of blood that gradually fills as you fight him. In Phase 2, the pool is deep enough to move through slowly. Some players have noticed that the blood level at the start of the fight is not 0. There is already a significant amount of blood in the pool when you enter. Mong has been performing his ritual before you arrived. You are not witnessing the beginning of something. You are arriving late to something that has been going on for some time. 86. Stargazer Ruins, located in the mountain tops of the Giants, contains a telescope. The telescope is pointed at a specific area of the sky. If you work out the angle of the telescope and map it against the in-game night sky, it is pointed at a cluster of stars that Ranni references in her dialogue about the age of stars. Whether this is a deliberate environmental connection or a coincidence of asset placement is debated, but the ruins being named Stargazer and containing a telescope pointed at those specific stars is difficult to dismiss. 87. There is a cave system in eastern Limgrave, accessible through a narrow crack in a cliffside, that contains mushrooms of a variety not found anywhere else in the game. The mushrooms are a pale pink and appear in item descriptions of consumable fungi as being noted for their calming properties. The cave itself has some of the quietest ambient audio in the game, almost completely silent. It feels like it was placed to be discovered by players who are exploring slowly rather than rushing toward objectives. 88. The Crucible Knight enemy has an attack animation that ends with a specific foot placement. The foot placement is a recognizable fencing stance, specifically a position used at the end of a lunge to maintain balance and prepare for a follow-up. The attack animation itself does not end the fight or require a follow-up, but the stance is there at the end of it regardless, suggesting whoever animated the Crucible Knight understood real swordsmanship technique well enough to include this kind of physical accuracy. 89. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, merged with a serpent god and speaks to you from inside its body. His dialogue during the boss fight is notable for one specific reason. He does not seem distressed about what he has become. He describes his plan to devour the gods themselves with something that reads as genuine conviction rather than madness. The possibility that Rykard's choice was a calculated one rather than a corruption or accident is one the game's lore supports, and it makes him one of the more interesting demigods in terms of motivation. 90. There is a ballista on the Stormvale Castle ramparts that is pointed at the Erd tree, not at any approach road or enemy formation, directly at the Erd tree. Given what is known about Godric and his position relative to the other demigods, this detail might suggest that Godric's allegiances were more complicated than they appeared, or it might simply be incidental positioning, but the orientation of the ballista is specific enough that it does not feel like an accident. 91. The Margit boss fight has a specific tell before he uses his spectral weapon attacks. His free hand closes into a fist slightly before the attack begins. This is a very small animation cue that most players cannot read in real time, but it is visible in slow-motion recordings, including a physical tell. For a magical attack that has no physical wind-up is the kind of design detail that gives expert players something to react to, while remaining invisible to everyone else. 92. The Deathbirds, large avian enemies that appear only at night and vanish at dawn, carry items that drop from their bodies that are associated with death magic and the rune of death. The birds themselves are described as shepherds of the dead, guiding souls to their destination. If this is true, then the death birds that attack the player are attacking a being that the game's lore says cannot permanently die. One reading is that the Deathbirds are not attacking out of aggression. They are attempting to do their job, and the player is an anomaly they do not know how to process. 93. There is a detail in the Liurnia of the Lakes region, where on certain weather cycles, the fog that covers the lake's surface is dense enough to obscure the bottom of the ruined buildings rising out of the water. In clear weather, you can see the submerged lower floors through the water. In heavy fog conditions, the lake looks bottomless. The variability of this visual, depending on weather, is the kind of emergent environmental detail that games rarely commit to, and it makes the flooded academy town feel genuinely different at different times of day. 94. There is a sleeping troll in the giant's mountain tops, whose snoring is loud enough to be audible before it becomes visible on screen. If you follow the sound, you will find it. It does not wake up unless attacked. Once asleep, it stays asleep indefinitely. The troll is positioned near a drop of significant height, and players have noted that it appears to be positioned at the very edge of the drop, as if it fell asleep mid-walk and stopped just before going over. The exact troll has a scratch on its left knee that does not appear on other trolls in the area. 95. The item description for the twin-bird kite shield references a bird that carries the living to death and returns to the living with the dead. This describes both directions of the deathbird's role as shepherd, but phrasing it in terms of a bird that carries things in two directions suggests the process of dying and returning is a cycle the world is meant to sustain rather than resist. Given that the player character is built on exactly this cycle, the shield's description reads as almost biographical. 96. The Divine Tower of Limgrave, which restores Godric's great rune if you defeat him and climb the tower, has a view from its highest accessible point that encompasses almost all of Limgrave. On a clear in-game day, you can see the Weeping Peninsula to the south, the coastline to the west, and Stormvale Castle below you. The tower was presumably used to observe all of this land before the shattering. Standing at the top and seeing the whole of the region spread below you is one of the quiet rewards the game offers players who take the time to climb all the way up. 97. There is a pool of still water in the Ainsel River main area that reflects the environment around it perfectly. Still water reflections are common in the game, but this pool is notable because it is positioned beneath a crack in the cave ceiling, through which a very faint light filters. The reflection of that light in the pool is the only source of illumination for a significant radius around it. Players who find it describe the effect as unexpectedly peaceful for a region that is otherwise quite hostile. 98. The Bell-Bearing Hunter, which appears as an invasion-type enemy at certain locations at night, wears armor that belongs to the same set as a merchant you may have already killed or traded with. This is a direct implication that the Bell-Bearing Hunter and the merchants share a connection or an origin, given that killing merchants drops bell bearings that take their inventory to the Twin Maiden husks at the hold, and the Bell-Bearing Hunter appears in locations associated with merchants. The hunter may be a kind of guardian or enforcer for the merchant network. 99. When you use a larval tear to rebirth your character's stat distribution, at Renala, the animation shows you being drawn into a golden light and emerging reformed. But the sound design for this moment uses a chord that is not in any other piece of music in the game. It is a single isolated sound played once during the rebirth sequence. Whether it was composed specifically for this moment or comes from somewhere else and the audio production is unclear, it sounds, to many players who have noticed it, like something ending. 100. Malenia, who appears to the player early in the game and serves as a guide, and eventually a sacrifice if you pursue the standard ending path, leaves when you choose the Frenzied Flame ending. She appears one final time in the Frenzied Flame ending cutscene, visible for only a moment, and she says a single line. The line is quiet enough in the mix that some players have watched the ending multiple times without catching it. The line suggests she intends to pursue you. Given what the Frenzied Flame ending means for the world, Malenia's final words are one of the few moments in the game's endings where the future is directly addressed by a character who survived it. 101. The full moon sorcery that Renala uses in her boss fight is described in item descriptions as a spell she developed herself, rather than learning from existing Carian tradition. The full moon appears again in the item description for the Ranni full moon sorcery available to players. The spell's description notes that it is incomplete, that Ranni was still working on it. The version she uses in the boss fight is her work in progress. The player is fighting a scholar's unfinished masterpiece. 102. There is an NPC phantom visible on a cliff edge in the mountain tops of the giants that disappears if you approach directly. If you watch from a distance, the phantom stands and looks toward the distant flame. If you look away and look back, it is gone. It does not have a name or a summon sign. It simply appears and vanishes. The community has not found an explanation tied to specific items or quest lines. It may be an NPC connected to cut content, or a developer-placed figure meant purely as environmental atmosphere. 103. The sound the Elden Ring makes when you interact with a great rune is different from the sound of any other item interaction in the game. Every other item has a soft chime or a page turn type sound when examined in the menu. The great runes produce a low resonant tone that lingers several seconds longer than the animation. The lingering audio suggests the runes are doing something beyond being passively observed. 104. There is a tarnished body on a merchant's cart in the Caelid region that is still holding an item. The item is not collectible, and the body is not interactive. The item appears to be a weapon, though the exact type is hard to distinguish at the angle the body is positioned. The cart is moving, slowly pushed by a donkey that is still alive. A dead body on a cart with a living animal pulling it suggests this merchant died recently enough that the animal has not yet stopped or wandered away. 105. Commander Nile, the boss in Castle Sol, is described in his lore as a veteran soldier who lost his legs and had the legs of fallen soldiers grafted onto him to continue serving. The legs he uses in the fight are visually distinct in their armor from his upper body. If you look at the armor on the grafted legs during the fight, it matches the armor worn by the spirit soldiers he summons. He is not just fighting alongside the memory of his fallen soldiers, he is carrying them with him, literally. 106. There is a small boat docked at the edge of the Academy Gate town that is waterlogged and partially sunk, but has not gone fully under. The boat has a lantern still attached to the prow that flickers with a very dim light. How the lantern is still burning after the flooding that submerged most of the town is something the game never addresses. Whether it is a magical lantern or simply an oversight in the environmental design is a question that does not have a clean answer. 107. The Stone Sword Imp statues, which block optional areas throughout the game, always face the player when they use the key to open them. The statues pivot to face you as the magic dissipates. No other static object in the game pivots to face the player. The motion is smooth and deliberate rather than a quick snap, suggesting the statues are aware of who freed them, even if they show no further reaction. 108. Dialos, a recurring NPC whose questline involves following him across multiple regions, wears increasingly damaged armor as his questline progresses. He starts at the Round Table Hold in pristine condition. Each subsequent appearance shows more wear, more damage, more evidence of loss. The visual degradation of his armor tracks his psychological state across the questline without a single line of dialogue drawing attention to it. 109. There is a type of flower found only in the inner Halig tree, in the section closest to Malenia's arena, that does not appear in any item description. It cannot be harvested. It grows in small clusters between the Halig tree's roots and has a golden pink color. The flower appears to be a cross between the Erd tree's golden bloom and the scarlet rot flowers of Caelid. Its existence, unremarked upon by the game, suggests the Halig tree, which was grown by Malenia from her own flesh, produced something genuinely new, something the world had not seen before. 110. The boss health bar for the Elden Beast, the true final boss, does not show the creature's name until Phase 2 of the fight. In Phase 1, you are fighting something called the Elden Beast, but the health bar reads something different. The name change between phases is one the game does quietly, without fanfare, and players who are not watching the health bar carefully will miss it. The name shift suggests what you are fighting changes in some fundamental way between the two phases, rather than simply becoming more dangerous. 111. The Eternal City of Nokron, accessible after defeating Radahn, contains mirrors positioned at specific angles throughout the city. The mirrors do not appear to have a function. They reflect the surrounding environment accurately, but some of them reflect light sources that are not visible from the position of the mirror, which suggests the mirrors are showing a version of the city that has different lighting than what the player currently sees. Whether this is a rendering quirk or intentional design is unclear. 112. There is a passage in the deepest section of the Ainsel River that requires a specific key item to access. Once inside, the room it leads to contains a single item on a pedestal. The item is one of the most narratively significant objects in Ranni's questline. The fact that it is protected this way, in the deepest and most remote section of an underground river, suggests that whoever placed it there wanted it found only by someone determined enough to have already done a great deal of work. 113. Patches has a specific piece of dialogue that he delivers only after you have been killed by one of his traps. The dialogue is different from what he says if you simply encounter him in conversation. It is more relaxed, almost friendly. Players who have compared both versions of his post-trap dialogue have noted that the version you get after being killed is the one where he seems most comfortable and most honest, which is deeply in character for a man who finds his work most satisfying when it succeeds. 114. The Glintstone Crown set, worn by Raya Lucaria sorcerers, has multiple variants with slightly different glintstone configurations in the crystal formations on the headpiece. The configuration of the crystals appears to correspond to rank or specialization within the academy, based on cross-referencing item descriptions for sorceries associated with specific crystal types. No in-game text directly explains the crown variants, but the correlation is consistent. 115. There is a giant skeleton in the ruins of the Liurnia lake floor, visible if you descend into the water in certain areas. The skeleton is too large to belong to any enemy type in the game, and appears to be a creature of a kind that does not exist in the game's bestiary. Given the age of the lake and what is known about Liurnia's geological history involving the Academy's influence on the land, this skeleton may be from a period the game's lore has not yet fully addressed. 116. The Erd leaf that Malenia carries and uses to kindle the torrent bond with the player has a specific visual in the cutscene. Where she gives it, the leaf appears to emit a faint pulse of light before she closes her hand around it. The pulse happens only once and is easy to miss. Given the significance of what the leaf represents, one reading is that the pulse is the grace contained in the leaf responding to her intent before the exchange is completed. 117. The ruins of Farum Azula, the crumbling dragon temple suspended in time, contains clocks. Actual clockwork mechanisms are visible in certain tower rooms with hands that are frozen in position. The game does not explain why a culture would develop clocks in a world with otherwise relatively low technology. Given that Farum Azula is described as a place outside of time, the clocks may have been built in recognition of that property, either to measure it or to mourn the loss of it. 118. The troll pulling the giant cannon in Limgrave, which most players use as a way to clear the large enemy groups near the Mistwood, has a chain attached to its collar that leads to the cannon but also has a secondary chain attached to a ring set into the ground. This secondary chain means the troll can move within a large radius around the cannon but cannot actually walk away from the location. It was placed here and chained here by someone who planned for it to be used as a weapon and wanted to ensure it stayed in position. 109. The frost build-up mechanic in the game causes a secondary proc of damage when the frostbite status fully triggers. The visual effect for this proc is a sudden expansion of ice crystals from the affected target's body. If you watch this effect closely on a humanoid enemy, the ice crystals follow the circulatory system in their pattern, spreading along paths that map to where blood vessels would be. This anatomical accuracy in an elemental status effect's visual representation is a detail that most players experience only as a flash of light. 120. There is a dog barking sound in the ambience of Leyndell that has no visible source dog. Lanedale has no dog-type enemies, and no visible dogs in its environment. The barking occurs on a timed loop, and is distinct from other ambient audio. Multiple players have attempted to triangulate its source, and found it appears to come from a locked building with no accessible entrance. Whatever is inside that building, the game decided it should be heard, but not seen. 121. The capital of Lanedale has a section of road near the outer wall that has wheel ruts pressed into the stone. Wheel ruts in stone require either extremely heavy repeated traffic or a very long period of use. The ruts are deep. Lanedale was a functioning capital for what the lore suggests was an enormous span of time, and these ruts are a physical record of that duration pressed into the city's infrastructure. 122. Torrent, when reared up on his hind legs in the jump animation, shows a split-second detail in his mane. The mane briefly becomes translucent, revealing what appears to be a faint starfield inside it. This is visible for maybe half a second, and only in certain lighting conditions. Players who have noticed it describe the effect as seeing through Torrent rather than at him, which is consistent with his nature as a spirit creature whose physical form is a construct. 123. There is a piece of writing carved into the base of the bestial sanctum's exterior wall that uses the same glyph system as the writing found in Fara Mazula. The sanctum is connected to Garank and by extension to Maliketh. The shared glyph system between the sanctum and Fara Mazula suggests a shared origin or a direct historical connection between the beast religion and whatever culture built the Dragon Temple, which is a connection the game's dialogue hints at, but never makes explicit. 124. The sleeping dragon Graol, the enormous dragon lying near Fort Feroth in Caelid, has smaller dragons clustered around her. The small dragons do not attack you unless you attack Graol. If you kill Graol by bleeding her out slowly, while her children watch, the children eventually attack. But there is a window after Graol dies, where the smaller dragons simply stand around her body, motionless, before their attack behavior triggers. That window is very brief. It is there. 125. The item called Golden Order Principia, a scripture text found in the game, contains a section about the nature of the Erd Tree's light that describes it as being borrowed rather than inherent. The text does not specify what it was borrowed from, given everything the game eventually reveals about what the Erd Tree is and what preceded it. This description of borrowed light is one of the earliest textual signals that the Golden Order's foundation is not what it presents itself as. 126. There is a lantern in the Lanedale sewers, the underground region, accessed during the late game, that is attached to a chain and slowly swings. No airflow or movement in the environment explains the swinging. It moves at a consistent tempo, slightly too slow to be a pendulum in normal gravity, slightly too fast to be settling from a disturbance. Some players have described it as the most unsettling thing in the sewers, specifically because there is no reason for it to be moving. 127. The Black Knife assassins who were responsible for stealing a fragment of the Rune of Death and killing Godwyn on the Night of the Black Knives leave no sound when they walk. Every other humanoid enemy in the game makes footstep sounds. The Black Knife assassins are completely silent. This is a design choice that makes them uniquely threatening in enclosed spaces, but it also communicates something about what these assassins were trained to be. Silence is not an ability they gained. It seems to be an absence they were built around. 128. The Flame of the Fell God, a sorcery dropped by Aidan the Shardbearer, has an item description that references Aidan's particular heresy as specifically involving freeing the Fell God from its imprisonment in the flame. Given that the Flame of the Fell God is an item the player can use to throw massive explosions of flame, and the Fell God in question is implied to be something imprisoned for very dangerous reasons, the casual availability of this sorcery through gameplay is a quietly dark joke the game tells without winking at it. 129. There is a well near the third church of Marika that contains a tarnished body at the bottom, visible if you look down. The body is at a depth that suggests it did not fall in accidentally. The well itself is described in nearby environmental details as being associated with Marika's early activity in the lands between. The body in the well has no explanation attached to it. It is simply there, deep in the water, in a location connected to the game's most central figure. 130. The Clean Rot Knights, who serve Malenia, retain their discipline and formation even in death. If you encounter a group of them as enemies, their patrol patterns follow military doctrine. They cover each other's angles, they do not overextend. This tactical behavior, maintained even in the rotted and degraded state in which they are found, suggests their training was comprehensive enough to survive whatever process transformed them into what they currently are. 131. There is a window in the Ranni the Witch Grand Library, the room where you fight Renala, that overlooks a courtyard. The courtyard contains a fountain. The fountain is running even though every other water feature in the academy that should be running has been stopped or destroyed by the conflict between factions within the school. This particular fountain's persistence may be because the courtyard it sits in was protected by Renala's barrier for the duration of the academy's internal conflicts. 132. The Tree Sentinel, the golden armoured knight that patrols the early area of Limgrave on horseback, has a patrol route that takes it in a specific loop. If you map the loop, it does not follow any obvious path or patrols sensible approaches to the nearby church. The loop instead appears to trace the shape of a much larger structure that no longer exists. The footprint of the phantom building the Sentinel is patrolling around is visible only as open ground, but it is large enough that whatever once stood there was significant. 133. The Crucible of Life, described in late-game lore, is referenced visually in several locations through a specific artistic motif. The motif involves overlapping circles that grow from a central point. This motif appears on the Crucible Knight armor, in certain floor patterns in Lanedell, on the Fell God's altar, and in the visual effect of Malenia's second phase transformation. The repeated motif across unconnected visual elements suggests the Crucible of Life concept underlies more of the game's cosmology than any single questline or area makes explicit. 134. The minor Erd trees found throughout the lands between are all damaged. Every single one of them shows signs of burning, withering, or physical damage. There is no intact minor Erd tree anywhere in the game world, given that they are extensions of the Erd tree itself. Their universal damage suggests the harm done to the Erd tree through the shattering was transmitted through all of its branches simultaneously. The game never explicitly makes this point. The environmental evidence simply exists for players who look at all of them. 135. Festering Fingerprint Vike, who appears as an invader NPC in Liurnia and later in the mountaintops of the Giants, has armor that is increasingly consumed by the frenzied flame between his two appearances. His first appearance shows the flame's influence beginning. His second shows it significantly advanced. He is in the process of being consumed across the chronological span of your playthrough. His invasion of your world is not aggression. Given his alignment with the frenzied flame, it may be a desperate attempt to do something, to stop something, or simply to not be alone. 136. The Spirit Calling Bell, given to the player by Roderica and used to summon spirit ashes, produces a sound that is different each time it is used, depending on which spirit ash you summon. The bell itself does not change. The sound it produces is being shaped by the spirit responding to the call. Whether this is a deliberate audio design choice or an emergent result of different sound assets triggering from the same animation is unclear, but the effect is that the bell sounds unique every time, which makes it feel genuinely alive. 137. There is a painting in the Carrier Manor that shows the Ranni the Witch Academy from an angle that does not exist in the game. The angle implies a viewpoint significantly higher than any accessible structure in the region. Whether the painting was created from imagination or from a vantage point that no longer exists, such as a tower destroyed in the conflict between the Carrions and the Academy, is left to interpretation. 138. Commander O'Neill, the field commander of Malenia's army, drops an item that references the unalloyed gold needle used in Millicent's questline. The connection between O'Neill and the needle, through the Scarlet Rot and Malenia's forces, is one of the longer chains of lore connection in the game, where an item dropped by one character unlocks understanding of a completely separate character's situation. 139. The Godskin duo boss fight, which many players find frustrating for its two-on-one nature, has a specific detail in the room where it takes place. The room is a crumbling Farum Azula chamber. The Godskins, operating in a place connected to time's end, is relevant to their lore as beings whose purpose involves the killing of gods. One reading is that they were not placed in Farum Azula, but were drawn there by its nature, as beings whose work is ending things, being pulled toward a place where all things are ending. 140. Ranni's dull body, the physical vessel she uses throughout her questline, has articulated fingers. If you look at her hands during any dialogue sequence where she moves, the fingers bend and flex naturally. The care taken in animating a puppet's fingers suggests Ranni's presence in the doll is genuine enough to merit full body animation. Not a shortcut. 141. There is a set of ruins in the Siofra River area that has furniture inside, not just architectural ruins, but the remains of tables and chairs. Underground ruins. Having furniture suggests these were living spaces for people who planned to stay, not temporary structures. Given how deep underground Siofra is, and what the lore says about the eternal cities, the presence of domestic furniture reads as evidence of a civilization that was genuinely flourishing before whatever happened to it. 142. The Lich Dragon Fortisax boss, which is accessed through Fear's questline, can only be fought after completing a specific chain of events that most players who pursue multiple endings in a single playthrough will miss. The fight itself takes place in a dream or memory space. Fortisax is not the enemy, according to the lore of the fight. Fortisax is still there because he refused to abandon Godwyn, even after Godwyn's death. The fight is against a dragon in grief, holding on to something that is already gone. 143. There are rusted iron gates in Stormvale Castle that can be partially opened, but not fully. If you squeeze through the opening and look back at the gate from the other side, the rust pattern on the gate forms an irregular shape that looks from this specific angle like a face. The face is not there if you look at the gate from the entrance side. It only resolves as a face from inside the passage, after you have squeezed through. Whether this is an intentional Easter egg or a pareidolia-inducing rust texture is genuinely unclear. 144. The Albinaurics, half-human creatures created through sorcery and found throughout Liurnia and the Mogwyn Palace, have a walking animation that is slower than any other humanoid in the game. Their gait is careful, deliberate, as if every step requires consideration. Their lore describes them as artificial beings whose creation was imperfect, who suffer from physical limitations their makers did not fully solve. The walking animation communicates that suffering without dialogue. 145. Rykard's boss arena has a serpent god's stomach that the player fights through. The walls of the arena are organic rather than stone. As the fight progresses, the walls pulse with a rhythm that corresponds roughly to a heartbeat. The rhythm slows as Rykard takes damage. By the time he enters his second phase, the wall pulsing has noticeably decreased in frequency. The arena is alive, and it is dying along with Rykard. 146. There is a letter found in the Volcano Manor, separate from the questline letters, that is addressed to no one and signed with only an initial. The letter describes a specific room in the manor in enough detail to identify it. The room it describes contains a body that was there when the manor was first made accessible to the player. The letter may be from the body, written before what happened to them, or it may be from someone else entirely who knows the room. 147. The shard-bearer Malenia, when she uses Scarlet Aeonia in the fight, lands in the center of the arena and waits. She waits for a specific duration before the rot cloud blooms. The wait is long enough that players who do not know what is coming may approach. 1. Reading is that the wait is not a gameplay delay but an in-lore moment, where Malenia is releasing the scarlet rot deliberately and consciously, doing something she cannot do lightly, and the pause is that wait. 148. There is a grave in the Weeping Peninsula that is marked with a flower arrangement that matches the description of flowers associated with Erd Tree burial in the lands between. Most graves in the game have no flowers or have generic arrangements. This specific grave's flowers match an in-game item description closely enough that players with knowledge of the item text recognize the connection. 149. The Erd Tree avatar, which guards minor Erd trees and appears as a recurring boss, has a staff that is a branch from the Erd tree itself. If you look at the branch, the blossoms on it are in different states of health depending on which Erd tree avatar you are fighting. The one near the most damaged minor Erd tree has the fewest living blossoms. The connection between the avatars and the trees they guard appears to be more than territorial. 150. There is a corpse in the subterranean shunning grounds that is wearing a wedding dress. The subterranean area is a sewer system beneath Lanedale. The wedding dress is not explained by any item or NPC. It is in pristine condition despite its location. Whatever happened to bring someone dressed for a wedding into the sewers beneath the capital, the game has decided not to explain it. 151. The Lion Guardian enemy found in Redmane Castle has a mane that behaves differently depending on how the creature is moving. When the Lion Guardian is stationary, the mane hangs naturally. When it charges, the mane spreads out and rises slightly. This dynamic mane behavior uses the same physics system as cloaks and capes on humanoid characters, which means the same system developed for character clothing was applied to an enemy's biological feature. 152. The area surrounding the Erd tree has a specific visual distortion effect near the trunk. Looking directly at the trunk of the Erd tree from close range produces a slight lens effect in the air around the bark. This distortion is similar to the heat shimmer used near fire sources in the game. But the Erd tree is not producing heat visually. The distortion is associated with the presence of intense grace energy, and it is the only non-fire source in the game that produces this effect. 153. Sorceries learned from primeval sorcerer Azure have item descriptions that describe Azure in the past tense, despite the fact that you find him alive, albeit frozen in place. When you discover him in the academy, the past tense used in the sorcery descriptions suggests these were written after Azure was already considered gone, which points towards someone having documented his techniques before finding him in his current state, at a time when they believed he was dead. 154. There is a dragon corpse in the Farum Azula region that has collapsed across a stone bridge. The bridge is structurally damaged by the dragon's weight. If you walk across the dragon's body to cross the bridge rather than the stone path, the footing is different. The body surface has a different collision model than the bridge's stone. It is a small detail of physical simulation applied to a dead enemy's body that most players never think about. 155. Margit and Morgott are the same being, which most players know, but the item descriptions for their respective weapons describe their fighting styles in terms that are notably different. Margit is described as fighting with a cunning and deceptiveness that he uses to test Tarnished. Morgott is described as fighting with grief, the same entity described as cunning in one context and grief-stricken in another suggests the two personae are genuinely different expressions of the same person, not simply a disguise. 156. The mountaintops of the giants has a visual detail visible only at specific times of day. In the early morning lighting cycle, the shadows cast by the ancient frozen giants are extremely long. If you measure the shadow direction from these frozen figures, they all point toward the same location on the mountain. The location they point toward, when you reach it in the game, is the Flame of Ruin. Whether the shadows were placed intentionally to function as a directional indicator for players, or whether this is a coincidence of the sun angle and the giant figure's placement, is a question that does not have a clean answer. 157. The sounds made by the omen creatures, the large horned beings found in sewers and dungeons, include a vocalization that occurs only when they spot the player at long range. It is a specific sound used only by omens, only in that moment of distant detection. The sound was recorded rather than synthesized, and has a quality that most players describe as surprisingly mournful for an enemy type associated with violence and imprisonment. 158. There is a detail in the final area before the Erd tree's interior that involves the path the player walks being lined with bodies. The bodies are not enemies, they are tarnished. Some are in armor, some are in robes, Some are barely equipped at all. They came from across the lands between, and they did not make it through. The variety of their equipment and appearance suggests the game was deliberate about showing that every kind of tarnished attempt was made before yours. 159. The shattering is referenced in the environment through a consistent visual motif. Wherever the ground cracked during the shattering, the cracks are filled with golden light in some areas and dark void in others. The areas where the cracks fill with golden light are near sites associated with grace. The areas where they fill with dark void are near sites associated with death, or the rune of death. The shattering left different marks depending on what was close to where it fractured. 160. There is a torch bracket on the wall of the round table hold that is empty, without a torch. Every other torch bracket in the hold has a torch. The empty bracket is positioned near the hallway where Gideon Ofnir's study is located. Gideon does not mention the bracket. No item in the game references it. Its emptiness may be an oversight, or it may be the kind of environmental suggestion that the hold has been used for longer and by more people than what the player directly encounters. 161. The madness status effect, when it triggers, produces a visual effect that partially obscures the player's vision with what appears to be an eye pattern. The eye appears for only a fraction of a second at the edge of the trigger animation. Players who have frame-by-frame reviewed the madness trigger effect have identified the eye clearly. Given that the Flame of Frenzy is described in lore as a god entity that perceives and desires, the eye appearing in the madness effect may be something more than visual design. 162. There is a site of grace positioned inside Stormvale Castle that sits in a room that would have been a larder or cold storage based on its architecture, and the hooks mounted in the ceiling. Hooks without anything on them in a storage room, positioned directly below the hook points, combined with the grace fire being the only light source in the room, creates an atmosphere that the game achieves simply through space and function, without any additional horror elements layered in. 163. The Walking Mausoleum in the southern Weeping Peninsula, the first one most players encounter, has a carving on its exterior surface that is higher in quality and detail than the carvings on any of the other walking mausoleums in the game. The quality difference is consistent across multiple reviews of the model. Whether this specific mausoleum contains a more significant occupant than the others, or whether it was simply the first one modelled and received more detail before production standardized the asset, is not known. 164. The Crucible Knights found in the Landel area have a specific patrol route that takes them through areas of the city that were described in lore as being used for religious ceremony before the shattering. Their routes are not optimal for security coverage of the area. They pass through ceremonial spaces at a deliberate pace, which suggests their patrols may not be purely defensive, but may also maintain some form of ritual observance, continuing ceremonies that no longer have any living audience. 165. There is an underground section of the Siofa River that has lanterns hanging above the water. The lanterns are positioned at heights that suggest they were hung from boats or structures that are no longer there. The ropes they hang from extend upward into darkness. Whatever was holding them in place above no longer exists, and the lanterns now hang freely over water that has risen to meet them. 166. Millicent's questline ends with either her death by the player's hand or her death from the spreading rot. Both paths lead to the same place. The only item she leaves behind is the unalloyed gold needle, transformed into the Michaela's needle in one ending, or in a basic form in the other. The difference in the item is the difference in what she achieved before dying. One version of the needle can undo the frenzied flame's hold on the player, the other cannot. One possible reading is that what Millicent chose at the end determined whether her death meant something useful to someone else. 167. The Grafted Dragon, a weapon crafted from one of the dragon heads grafted onto Godric, retains the dragon's fire breath as its weapon skill. If you use the weapon art near Godric's throne room when revisiting the area, the flame from the skill briefly illuminates the severed arm collection on the walls. In that illumination, the rings on the grafted hands are briefly visible and clear. The moment of visibility was likely not planned as a guided revelation, but it functions as one. 168. There is a sealed door in the Volcano Manor that cannot be opened through any method discovered by the community since the game's release. The door has the same visual design as doors that are opened by specific questline progression, but none of the known questlines in the manor open this one. Whether it is connected to cut content, whether it is intended to be opened in a future update, or whether it is a non-functional environmental prop is unknown. 169. The Age of Stars ending, Ranni's ending, has a unique property compared to the other endings. It is the only ending in which another character directly accompanies you into the new age. Every other ending is solo. Ranni's ending shows her at the player's side as the stars move and the new age begins. Whether this is a reward for completing her questline, or whether it means something within the lore about what the Age of Stars requires, is something the community has read in multiple ways. 170. There is a detail in the Halig tree involving Miquella's presence. Miquella himself is not present in body in the accessible game world, having been taken by Mog, but his influence is visible throughout the Halig tree in specific environmental choices. The Halig tree has flowers that lean toward a central path. The path is the route a visitor would take moving toward where Malenia's chamber is, which is where the Halig tree is rooted most deeply. The flowers are oriented as if pointing toward what remains of Miquella's work, even in his absence. 171. The Knight Bernal, who begins as a sort of mentor figure at the Volcano Manor and becomes a late-game invader, wears Volcano Manor armor throughout. His late-game invasion dialogue is different from his early-game dialogue in emotional register. Early Bernal is measured and professional. Late Bernal invasion dialogue is brief and has a quality that reads as resignation. He is doing something he has decided to do rather than something he wants to do. 172. There is a ruin in the Caelid region that has a functioning gate mechanism. The gate is rusted and can only be moved with significant player interaction, but it does move. The gate, when opened, leads to an area that contains nothing notable. The gate's functionality, with no reward for opening it, suggests it was either part of a system that had content removed from behind it, or was placed purely as an environmental detail of a ruin that still partially works. 173. The stone sword keys, mentioned earlier for the imp statues they open, have an additional detail in their item description that specifies they are made from stone that remembers being a sword. This phrasing suggests the stone was once a real sword and was transformed rather than merely carved into sword shape. If the key material has memory, what the imps are reading when you use the key may not be the key itself, but the memory of the weapon it used to be. 174. There is a detail in the geography of the lands between that is not immediately obvious. The region called Caelid, which is the scarlet rot-affected area east of Limgrave, is positioned such that the prevailing wind direction, based on cloud and particle movement in the game world, would carry material from Caelid into Limgrave over time. The rot has not reached Limgrave in the game's current state, but the environmental conditions suggest it is a matter of time rather than impossibility. 175. The talisman pouch items, which expand the number of talismans you can equip, are described as having been left for the player. Specifically, they are not found as general loot. They are positioned in specific locations, connected to NPCs, or as rewards for specific actions. The description that they were left for you implies intention. Someone anticipated you and prepared for your arrival. Given the game's themes about Grace and the Tarnished's guided return, the pouches being personalized is consistent with a broader design philosophy. 176. There is a puddle near the base of the first step site of Grace at the very beginning of the game that reflects the Erd tree. It is the first reflective surface most players will encounter. In still weather conditions, the reflection is clear and complete. In moving weather, the reflection distorts. Standing at the very beginning of the game, looking at a reflection of the Erd tree that distorts depending on conditions, is as literal a metaphor for the game's central theme as anything in the opening cutscene. 177. The crafting system allows the player to make a variety of items from materials found in the world. One category of craftable item is fire grease, which adds fire damage to weapons. The item description for fire grease notes that the technique was developed by people who could not access sorcery or incantations, but needed effective combat tools. This places the crafting system within the game's class and power structure, framing it not as a neutral mechanic, but as a historical response to inequality in the game's world. 178. There is a specific camera angle that occurs when the player is hit by a large enough attack to send them flying, at the apex of the flying animation. Before the falling begins, the camera briefly smooths and the player character is visible from a slight distance, in what amounts to a cinematic angle. This camera behavior was noted in early reviews and is one of the ways the game frames devastating moments as almost theatrical, making the violence feel grand rather than simply punishing. 179. The remembrances, the items left behind by major bosses and which can be converted into their signature weapons or spells, are described as crystallizations of their entire life, not their death. Their life, this means every fight that ends with you collecting a remembrance, has been, in some sense, a summary of who that person was, and the weapon you make from it carries the entirety of that life in its use. 180. There is a column in the Church of Vows that has a scratch mark on it at knee height. The scratch is narrow and consistent with something being tied to the column and struggling against the tie. Given that the Church of Vows contains the celestial dew used to absolution and has lore connecting it to the founding of the pacts governing the lands between, the scratch on the column is a quietly uncomfortable detail in an otherwise serene location. 181. The wandering nobles, the weakest humanoid enemies in the game, sometimes die without the player touching them. If you watch a group of them from a distance, on rare occasions one will simply collapse. The death animation is the same as when they are killed by the player. They are dying on their own. Given their description as people who have lost purpose and direction after the shattering, the ones that die without cause may be the game's most direct representation of what the shattering did to ordinary people. 182. The glintstone pebble, the most basic sorcery in the game, available from the very start if you choose a sorcery build, has an item description that calls it a sorcery that fundamentally encapsulates the practice of glintstone sorcery. It is not described as a beginner spell. It is described as a distillation of the entire discipline. This framing makes the humble pebble into something philosophically significant, the whole art in its most minimal expression. 183. There is a well in Lanedale that has been deliberately filled with rubble. The rubble was placed intentionally, based on how it is arranged, with larger pieces on the outside, creating a ring, and smaller pieces filling the center. Someone decided to close this well permanently, and did so carefully. Whatever was in the well, or whatever the well led to, was closed off by someone who wanted to make sure it stayed closed. 184. The talisman called the Moon of Noxtella, which increases memory slots for sorceries, is described as a star ornament made by the ancient Nox people of the Eternal City. If you look at its model in the equip screen, the ornament has a face on one side. The face is not visible in the inventory thumbnail. It appears only when the 3D model is displayed in the equip menu. The face is of indeterminate age or gender and looks upward. 185. Commander Niall's boss room, as mentioned earlier, involves leg-grafted armor. An additional detail is that the room itself has banners that are fraying. The fraying is not uniform across all banners. Specific banners are more heavily damaged, particularly the ones closest to the doors. This pattern suggests the banners closest to where enemies and weather enter the room have deteriorated faster, which is accurate to how fabric behaves in a castle that has seen better days. 186. There is a sleeping enemy in the Raya Lucaria Academy near the debate parlour that will not wake up under normal circumstances. It can be killed in its sleep. If you read the nearby item descriptions and consider what the debate parlour was used for, the sleeping enemy is in an area that was likely used for strenuous magical exercises. The sleep may not be natural rest, but exhaustion of a very specific kind. 187. The description of the Godslayer's greatsword references a greatsword used by the Crucible, or more specifically, a weapon associated with the Glowmide Queen. The Glowmide Queen's identity is one of the more sustained mysteries in the game's community discussion. Her connection to the Godskins, who use Godslayer incantations, means the sword in the player's hands carries the weight of a lineage whose full story the game has not completely told. 188. There is a bird in Lanedale that perches on a specific architectural feature every time the player enters the area. The feature is a decorative finial at the corner of a building. The bird is not an enemy. It flies away if you approach, returns if you back off, and is present every time the area loads. The consistency of its presence on the same exact point suggests it was placed as an environmental detail on a specific object rather than being part of a random ambient bird spawner. 189. The Rain of Fire incantation, usable by the player, is described as a power associated with the ancient dragons. If you use Rain of Fire inside a building, the fireballs pass through the ceiling without interaction. Every other fire effect in the game is blocked by geometry. Rain of Fire's ceiling passing behavior suggests the incantation was designed around outdoor large-scale combat and was not adjusted for indoor use, preserving a small inconsistency that tells you something about the scale at which the dragons used this power. 190. There is a waterfall near the entrance to the Ainsel River main that produces a sound that the community has recorded and analysed. The waterfall sound contains a pattern that some players have identified as a slowed-down version of a melody from the game's score. Whether this was intentional audio design, a coincidence of the recording used for the waterfall ambience, or a form of pareidolia in the audio realm is genuinely unclear. Multiple people have noticed it independently. 191. The Elden Star's incantation, which summons a shower of golden light from the Erd Tree, has an item description that says it was used to call the Greater Will's envoy. The Greater Will is the cosmic entity behind the Erd Tree and the Golden Order. Using the incantation as a weapon means you are using the method of summoning a divine being as an offensive tool, which is either a profound act of blasphemy or a profound act of power depending on whose perspective you take. 192. There is a giant jar, much larger than Alexander, that can be found embedded in a cliff in the mountain tops of the Giants. It is not interactive. It has no item nearby that explains it. Its size relative to Alexander, who is already enormous, suggests it was made for someone or something of extraordinary scale. Given what is known about the origin of the living jars, what that jar contains, or was meant to contain, is a question the game answers with silence. 193. The jellyfish shield is described as made from a hardened jellyfish carapace. If you look at the shield's model and then look at the jellyfish creatures in the game, the shield's surface texture matches the jellyfish body texture closely. The match between the material source and the finished item's appearance is consistent with the game's general approach to crafting lore, where items look like what they claim to be made from. 194. The twin maiden husks at the Round Table Hold, who sell you items from bell bearings, are described as the joined remains of two maidens who offered themselves to serve indefinitely. If you look closely at the model, you can see the seam where two bodies were joined. The construction is visible in the texture. The commitment to showing the physicality of what the husks are, rather than abstracting it, is characteristic of From Software's approach to difficult lore elements. 195. There is a location in the Halig tree that has a permanent sound effect of children laughing. There are no children visible or accessible in the area. The sound is faint and sounds like it comes from the Halig tree's branches above. Whether the sound represents the spirits of children the Halig tree was meant to shelter, or something else entirely, it is one of the game's most effective uses of audio to create an atmosphere of something that is almost, but not quite, safe and warm. 196. Morgoth the Omen King, encountered as the final boss before entering Lanedale's inner sanctum, has a speech before the fight that includes a specific phrase about the Erd Tree's blessing being denied to him. The Omen are described as cursed beings, outcasts from the Golden Order due to their monstrous physical characteristics. Morgoth, who is the son of Godfrey and Marika, and therefore royal, was born as an omen. His anger in the pre-fight speech is not aggression. It is the speech of someone who has spent their entire life protecting something that was never willing to acknowledge them. 197. The decoration on the Elden Ring's image, as seen in promotional materials and in-game when referenced, always shows it as a complete circle. But when fragments of it appear in item descriptions, the fragments are always described in terms of what they hold rather than what they are. Each fragment holds a law, a fundamental rule, rather than being a piece of a physical object. One reading is that the Elden Ring is not an object at all, but a collection of bindings, and the circle is simply the symbol used to represent the idea of them being whole. 198. There is an archway in the Academy Gate Town ruins that still stands fully intact despite the surrounding structure having completely collapsed. The archway is positioned such that it frames the Erd tree from the correct viewing angle, almost perfectly centered. Whether this is architectural deliberateness in the original construction of the town, or a coincidence of which sections of the building survived the flooding, the framing effect is striking, and players who discover it tend to stop and photograph it. 199. The item description for the smith script weapons, which are associated with the smithing master NPCs, references a tradition of weaponsmiths who dedicated their craft to the forging of weapons for the Tarnished specifically. This implies foreknowledge. The smiths associated with these items were not simply smiths who later happened to serve Tarnished. They prepared for the Tarnished's arrival. Given how the broader lore frames the Tarnished's return as something guided by grace, the smith's preparation suggests the return was known to be coming long before it happened. 200. There is a specific path through the Lake of Rot, the most dangerous traversal section in Ranni's questline, that allows the player to cross with minimal damage if they know where to step. The path is not marked. There is no item or NPC that tells you where it is. But if you look at the environmental design of the lake, the lily pad-like rock formations that rise above the rot surface follow a line that, if used as stepping stones, creates a near-complete crossing route. The route is there. You have to see it. 201. The Natural Born of the Void, an optional boss, is accessed through a puddle of dark water in the underground areas. It is a horror-type enemy that defies easy description, being an assembly of eyes, mouths, and mass. Its item drops suggest it is connected to a tradition of black knife assassination and void magic. The enemy appears to have been constructed from multiple things that should not be combined, which is its own kind of commentary on what the game's world has allowed through desperate experiments in power. 202. There is a building in Volcano Manor with a broken fireplace. The fireplace has been cracked in half from the inside, as if something inside it expanded suddenly and catastrophically. The manor is built on or near a volcano. Heat effects inside buildings in the manor are visible throughout, but a fireplace broken from the inside, rather than damage from outside heat or impact, suggests something specific happened in this room. Something that started at the fireplace and expanded outward. 203. The albinauric bow, which drops from certain albinauric enemies, has an item description that notes the albinaurics developed their own bow-making technique adapted to their physical limitations. The bow's design, in the 3D model, is visibly different from human bows in its draw weight and grip configuration. The albinauric weapon reflects a culture that had to develop its own material culture from scratch, adapting to a body type their makers did not optimize for function. 204. There is a chair in the round table hold that is positioned facing a blank wall. It is the only chair in the hold not positioned to face the table or another occupant. It has been placed against the wall, and someone has been sitting in it facing nothing. The chair has no NPC associated with it, and no item nearby. It is the kind of environmental detail that accumulates meaning precisely because the game refuses to explain it. 205. The deathbed dream sequence, accessed by sleeping in Fia's embrace late in her quest line, shows a version of the Altus Plateau that is subtly wrong. The sky colour is different. Specific landmarks that exist in the waking game are absent, and there are structures visible in the dream that do not exist in the accessible world. The dream is not a perfect memory of the plateau. It is a version of it filtered through something. And what that filter is adds uncertainty to the entire sequence. 206. There is a detail about the grafted scion encountered in the tutorial area, and again as an optional boss later. The second encounter's version of the grafted scion is larger, not dramatically, but measurably. The difference in scale between the tutorial version and the optional boss version is consistent across reports and suggests grafted scions grow, or this specific one was fed and expanded in the time between the player's encounters with it. 207. The spectral jellyfish spirit ash summon, the first one most players receive and often dismissed as weak, has an idle animation in which it moves in a pattern that closely mimics the movement of real jellyfish. The bell expansion and contraction, the tentacle trail, the gentle rotation. Whether this is motion captured from footage or simply well-observed animation work is unknown, but the naturalism of the movement stands out in a game with many fantastical creatures. 208. There is a tibia marina, one of the skeletal boat enemies, that is present in Liurnia, in a location significantly inland from any water source. The tibia mariners in other locations are near bodies of water appropriate to their boat. This inland one has its boat sitting on dry grass, whether this one has always been inland, indicating the ground was once water, or whether it walked or drifted there from a nearby lake, is a question the game does not address. 209. The Liurnia of the Lakes region has a settlement of fishermen visible on the western shore that is partially wrecked but still has signs of recent habitation. Fires, recently used fishing equipment, personal effects that have not weathered significantly. But there are no living fishermen anywhere near the settlement. Something happened to the inhabitants recently enough that their tools and fires remain, but they are gone without any visible violence having occurred at the settlement itself. 210. There is a seal, the kind used as a catalyst for incantations, called the Dragon Communion Incantations. The seal's design shows a dragon's throat, and using a Dragon Communion incantation through this catalyst visually changes the character's stance during the cast. The character grips the seal differently. Whether this was a deliberate animation variant or a coincidence of the seal's model affecting the grip calculation is unclear, but the effect exists. 211. Nefeli Lux's questline, if completed successfully, results in her becoming the ruler of Stormvale Castle following Godric's death. If you revisit Stormvale Castle after this point in her questline, you can find her sitting on the castle's throne. The throne room is unchanged. The army that filled the castle remains. But she is there, alone on the throne, in a castle that belongs to her now. The game provides no fanfare for this moment. She is simply sitting there. 212. The Erd tree's roots, which extend throughout the underground of the game world, have a visual detail that becomes apparent only when you spend significant time in the underground areas. The roots glow. But the glow is not uniform. Some sections of root are brighter, and some are darker. The brightness pattern changes over time. The roots pulse with varying intensity, as if something is moving through them, distributed unevenly, ebbing and flowing across the entire underground network. 213. There is a tarnished body in the outer wall of Lanedell that has fallen in a position suggesting it fell from above. The posture is collapsed forward, arms still extended as if reaching for something. The wall is high enough that a fall from the top would be fatal. There is an accessible point above where the body lies. Whatever this tarnished was reaching for, or running toward, or fleeing from at the top of the wall is not visible from either vantage point. 214. The golem enemies, which are found at key approaches to major areas and function as gate guardians, carry bows large enough that no human could draw them. The arrows they fire are the size of spears. If you collect one of these arrows after it lands, it is not a collectible item. You cannot pick them up. They embed in the ground and stay there. After a short time they despawn. Players who have looked closely at an embedded golem arrow before it despawns note that it has a specific fletch design that matches no quiver or arrow item in the player's inventory. 215. Millicent is one of 4 sisters spawned from Malenia's scarlet rot, according to the lore. The other 3 sisters are encountered during Millicent's questline in a specific optional encounter. Each sister has a different color palette for their rot-infused appearance, ranging from deep red to pale orange to almost yellow. The color variation across the sisters may represent different stages or expressions of the scarlet rot, with Millicent's pale appearance being the most stable form. 216. There is a message system that allows players in online mode to leave messages for others. The messages use a fixed template system rather than free text. The most common messages left in a specific location in front of a hidden illusory wall are messages pointing toward the wall. This is a community behavior rather than a game design element, but it represents one of the ways the game's community has developed its own conventions, which is something From Software has cultivated intentionally across all their interconnected online games. 217. The item called Warming Stone, which creates a small warmth-generating object when used, has a description that says it was developed by a sorcerer who loved someone who was always cold. The practical utility of the item, as a healing pulse in a small area, is useful in multiplayer, but the origin story attached to it frames it as something made for love rather than for combat, which is a rare warmth in a game that tends toward tragedy in its item lore. 218. There is a pool of blood in the subterranean shunning grounds that has not dried despite the age of the area. The shunning grounds are ancient. Blood dries and degrades quickly. A pool that has not dried suggests either that it is being renewed periodically, that something in the environment is preserving it, or that the game's environmental design did not account for the passage of implied time. The presence of the frenzied flame nearby, which has its own relationship with the metaphysics of decay and destruction, offers one possible in-world explanation. 219. The sleeping hand that you walk across to reach Malenia's arena, the enormous severed hand visible in the Halig tree roots, is described in item texts nearby as a hand that reached toward the Erd tree. The Halig tree was grown as an attempt to replicate the Erd tree's functions. This hand, reaching in the direction of the original tree from within the roots of the imitation, is one of the game's more visually direct representations of aspiration ending in failure. 220. There is a painting in the round table hold visible behind Gideon Ofnir that shows a map that partially overlaps with the accessible game world, but includes regions that do not exist in the player's game. The regions beyond the map's edge are not labelled and have no items or lore connected to them. Whether these represent areas cut from the game, areas that exist in the lore but were not implemented, or simply artistic extrapolation by the in-world cartographer who painted the map, is not known. 221. The falling star beast enemy, the crustacean-like creature that fell from a star, has a crater around it when first encountered at Celia Crystal Tunnel. The crater is precise in its radius and depth, consistent with an impact from above rather than from the side. The beast is in the center of the crater. It has been here long enough that the surrounding environment has adjusted to its presence, but the crater has not filled in, suggesting the impact was relatively recent by the geological timescales the game implies. 222. There is a specific NPC, a hooded figure visible in the Lanedale Outer Walls area, who walks a very slow route between 2 points and then disappears when they reach the second point. They do not reappear at the first point on a visible loop. They walk from A to B and are gone. If you follow them the entire route, which takes several in-game minutes of slow walking, they simply step out of existence at the end point. Whether this is an NPC with unimplemented functionality, a ghost-type environmental figure, or a rendering boundary artifact is unknown. 223. The Cuckoo Knights of the Academy, who are the militant arm of Raya Lucaria, wear armor with a feather motif. The cuckoo is a bird known for laying its eggs in other birds' nests, using their resources to raise its young. The Academy itself is described in lore as having infiltrated and exploited the Carian royal family's resources, building itself up on their land and support. The name Cuckoo Knight is not an accident. 224. There is a moment in the Radahn boss fight, specifically in his second phase when he falls from the sky, where the camera tracks his descent from above before snapping back to the player perspective at the moment of impact. This camera behavior, briefly pulling out from the player's first person to show the event from a wider angle before returning, is used nowhere else in the game. It was developed specifically for this single moment, which gives some indication of how significant the developers considered the Radahn re-entry to the narrative of the fight. 225. The sorcery called Ranni's Dark Moon, which is distinct from Renala's Full Moon, has an item description that compares the two deliberately. The comparison notes that Ranala's moon is gold with warmth, while Ranni's is cold and dark. The mother taught one version, and the daughter developed another. The development of Ranni's moon away from gold and toward cold darkness is described with entirely neutral language in the item text, which is itself a kind of editorial choice. 226. There is a detail visible in the Star Scourge Radahn boss fight that is only accessible to players using ranged builds. If you fight Radahn from a distance during Phase 1, rather than engaging in mounted melee, you can see him more clearly between charges. In those moments when he is repositioning for another charge, you can see the two great swords in his hands are not held identically. One is gripped in a formal fighting stance, and one is dragging behind him slightly, the way you might hold something too heavy to maintain clean form. 227. The lands between as a whole has a directional geography that is rarely commented on, but structurally consistent. Moving north means moving toward colder and higher altitude regions. Moving south means moving toward the sea and warmer coastal conditions. Moving east leads into rot and danger. Moving west leads toward the coast and relative safety. This directional logic is consistent enough that players who internalize it can navigate using instinct rather than the map for significant stretches. 228. There is a brazier in Farum Azula that is positioned at the edge of a floating platform with nothing below it. The brazier is lit. Maintaining a lit fire on the edge of a floating structure that drifts in wind and time makes no practical sense from a safety standpoint. The fire's existence there suggests either automated maintenance that continues without human oversight, or that fire in Farum Azula burns through some mechanism that does not require the usual conditions. 229. The depraved perfumer enemies use perfume bottles as weapons, generating volatile reactive sprays. Their item drops include these bottles, which reference a practice of using scent as a form of alchemical warfare that predates the Golden Order. The lore around perfumers suggests they were a legitimate profession before their practices became military in nature. The scent as weapon concept being treated with full weapon design commitment in the game's moveset development is one of the more unusual decision chains in Elden Ring's weapon variety. 230. There is a specific sound that plays when you stand inside the Erdtree's light in areas where it is strong enough to produce a visual effect. The sound is almost inaudible under the game's default audio settings. It is a very high-frequency tone, present consistently wherever the Erdtree's light is concentrated. Players who have adjusted their audio settings to boost high frequencies have described the tone as similar to singing, though not human in quality. The tone is absent in grace sights and absent in golden light outside the Erdtree's direct beam. 231. The Crucible of Life, referenced earlier, appears in a specific incantation called Aspects of the Crucible. Each aspect's incantation adds a physical feature to the player character, a tail, horns, or breath that is described as a feature of the original undifferentiated form of life before it was refined into the current races of the world. Using these incantations visually transforms the player into something archaic. The Crucible Knights, who protect the use of these incantations, are protecting something older than the current world order, and the incantations available to the player are a means of temporarily becoming it. 232. There is a giant's foot, severed and lying in the mountain tops of the giants, that has a detail in its texture. The toenails of the giant's foot have grown out to an extraordinary length and curled. Growth of this kind requires time and requires continued biological function after death, which giants in this game are described as being capable of due to the curse on their kind. The detail is not mentioned anywhere. It is simply part of the model. 233. The serpent snail enemies found in the volcano area have shells that contain a second creature inside. If you look at the shell opening during combat, you can see movement inside distinct from the snail portion of the creature. The second creature inside the shell does not appear to have game mechanical presence. It exists visually inside the shell as part of the enemy's model. What it is not explained. 234. There is a ladder in the Stormvale Castle area that leads to a rooftop where a crow drops a large consumable item. If killed, the crow will not be there if you approach the ladder from below in a way it can hear. If you approach from an adjacent rooftop without climbing the ladder, the crow is visible and the item is droppable. The crow's awareness radius, being exploitable by a specific approach path, is a detail of enemy AI design that most players never discover because the obvious path to the rooftop triggers the crow's alert too early. 235. The Golden Vow incantation, which buffs both the caster and nearby allies, is described as a vow made to the Erd Tree's light. The buff it provides strengthens attacks and improves defense simultaneously. The combination of these effects, rather than one or the other, suggests the vow is not about becoming more offensive or more defensive, but about committing fully to an action. The game treats commitment as a power, which is consistent with a number of its broader thematic elements. 236. There is an outdoor area in Castle Morn where the wind audibly moves through the battlements in a way that creates a whistling tone that changes pitch depending on where you stand within the area. The tone is lower near the outer walls and higher near the interior structures. This acoustic variance was either modeled deliberately to reflect the architecture's effect on airflow, or is an emergent product of the game's wind sound system, interacting with the collision geometry. But the effect is there regardless of cause. 237. The demi-human enemies sometimes make sounds that are almost words. The audio used for their vocalizations is a heavily processed human voice. Unprocessed, the sounds are close enough to language, but players who have isolated the audio clips report hearing fragments that sound like pleading or confusion rather than aggression. Given the lore of the demi-humans as a people with complex social structure that has been disrupted by the game's broader catastrophes, the almost language of their vocalizations fits. 238. There is a tower in East Limgrave that has a locked door and no key available in the early game. If you return to this tower after progressing significantly into the game's midsection, the door is still locked and no key has become available. The tower has no quest association. It cannot be accessed. Whatever is inside it is inaccessible without a key the game does not provide, which suggests either cut content, a very deeply hidden secret that the community has not found, or simply a tower with a locked door and nothing behind it. 239. There is a location called the Frenzied Flame Prescription in the subterranean shunning grounds. The name prescription refers to a formal prohibition or ban. The frenzied flame has been banned officially from the lands between, and it is hidden in the deepest accessible point of the underground sewers. The formal prohibition of something that is nevertheless allowed to exist, simply pushed below everything, is one of the game's many instances of institutions claiming to do something while actually doing something slightly different. 240. The 4 belfries in Liurnia are teleportation belfries that access different locations in the game world. The 4 locations they access are a section of Faramazula, the Chapel of Anticipation where the game begins, the Precipice of Anticipation, which is an inaccessible early game area, and an opening cinematic area. The selection of what the belfries access is not random. Each location is a beginning or a point of major transition. The belfries are designed to connect places where something important starts. 241. The Chapel of Anticipation, revisited through the 4 belfries, contains the boss that killed most players at the game's opening. The Grafted Scion is defeatable on the revisit. It drops a weapon, but the chapel also contains something else. After the Scion is gone, the chapel is quiet and empty in a way it was not during the opening sequence, when the environment had more life to it. The emptiness of the revisit is a different experience than the opening, and standing in the now quiet space after having cleared it carries its own weight. 242. There is a small shrine near the fourth church of Marika that has a broken statue. The statue has been broken at the neck, cleanly. The head is not visible near the base where it would have fallen. Someone removed the head after breaking it off. What the statue depicted before the head was removed is reconstructible based on the body and robes. But without the head, it is ambiguous whether it depicted Marika or another figure. 243. The tree spirits, large boss enemies found in underground or sealed areas of the game, are described in lore as being born from the Erd tree's roots, absorbing the bodies of the dead. They are, in the most literal sense, made of people who were buried. Their appearance, which involves organic root structures mixed with human-like features, visualizes this construction. The tree spirit is not a creature that lives in the roots. It is the roots, having absorbed and been shaped by what they consumed. 244. There is a message inscribed above the entrance to the stranded graveyard, the tutorial area, that most players pass through quickly at the beginning of the game. The message is in a fabricated script and has not been fully translated by the community to everyone's satisfaction. The presence of text above the entrance to the area where the game begins, in an alphabet the game does not teach you to read, is characteristic of Elden Ring's approach to giving you more information than you can access, and less explanation than you need. 245. Malenia's second phase is triggered by a specific threshold of health loss, at which point she transforms by sprouting wings of scarlet rot. The wings grow from her back, and they grow fast. If you watch the growth at the beginning of Phase 2, rather than immediately repositioning for the fight, the growth animation is detailed enough to show veining in the wing membrane as it expands. The detail of the veining during the rapid growth sequence represents significant animation budget spent on a transition most players interrupt by attacking. 246. The ancestral pillars in the Siofra River area, which are activated to unlock the Ancestor Spirit boss fight, are connected to each other by a subtle light trail visible only when all but one has been lit. The trail appears for only a moment before fading, connecting the last lit pillar to the unlit one. This directional indicator is gentle enough that many players miss it and have to find the last pillar through exploration, which the game seems to consider the intended approach. 247. There is a sleeping dog in Castle Morn, distinct from the sleeping dog at Volcano Manor mentioned earlier. This one is in the courtyard and sleeps through all combat around it, including the misbegotten attacks that occur in the same courtyard. The misbegotten enemies do not attack the dog. The dog does not react to the misbegotten. The dog and the misbegotten share a space without interaction, which is either a scripting oversight or an intentional detail, suggesting some relationship between the misbegotten and the dog that is never addressed. 248. The rotten crystal sword, found in Caelid's crystal caves, has a description that references swords being buried in the caves as offerings, only to be transformed by the scarlet rot into their current form over time. The sword's model shows crystal growths that follow the original weapon's edge, rather than growing randomly across the surface. The rot did not destroy the sword, it grew along it, following the existing form. This distinction is noted nowhere, but is visible in the model. 249. There is a corpse in the Round Table Hold's basement that is wearing the same armor as an NPC who appears to have survived in the Hold's main floor. The armor is not identical in condition, the basement version being more worn, but the style and insignia match. Whether this means the NPC has been in the Hold much longer than their dialogue implies, or whether the basement corpse is a different person who wore the same order's armor, is not resolved. 250. The giant crusher weapon has an item description that simply describes the weapon's size and effect, which is unusual. Most weapon descriptions in the game include historical context, the weapon's origin, or the person it was associated with. The giant crusher's description is matter-of-fact to an almost comic degree, Given the weapon is a large sphere of stone on a stick, the absence of mythologized origin story reads as the game being straightforwardly honest about what it is. 251. There is a series of small stone cairns near the bestial sanctum that have been arranged by hand. Cairns in the real world are used as trail markers, memorials, or ritual markers. These particular cairns are not on a path. They are arranged in a small group away from any route. The arrangement, three cairns of varying height close together, does not correspond to any known practice in the game's lore. They are simply there, as if someone visited this location repeatedly and built something each time they came. 252. The abductor virgins, the Iron Maiden-like enemies that abduct the player into an alternate boss area if they kill you, have gears visible in their mechanism when their casing opens. The gears are accurate to their described function. They appear to be part of a compression and folding mechanism. Whether someone at From Software researched mechanical engineering to get the gear arrangement right, or whether they simply looked plausible, the internal mechanism of the abductor is rendered with enough detail that a mechanical reading of it is possible. 253. There is a body of water in the Ainsel River area that reflects stars even though it is underground and has no visible sky above it. The reflection is not the cave ceiling. It is a star field. This detail is one of the more direct visual connections between the underground spaces and the cosmological themes associated with the eternal cities, whose people were described as having a relationship with the stars that differed from the surface world's relationship with the Erdtree. 254. The Volcano Manor's dining hall, which is where you first meet Lady Tanith, has a meal on the table. The food is not fully rendered at high detail but is clearly present. The meal appears to be unfinished, rather than merely set. Some dishes show signs of partial consumption, while others are untouched. Someone was eating and left this table recently. Whether Tanith herself was eating before you arrived, or whether the meal was prepared for guests who have not yet been received, the dining detail makes the manor feel occupied in a way that pure architecture does not. 255. There is a painting in the Carrier Manor Library that depicts a snowstorm. The painting is not interactive and is not connected to any known questline. The Carrier Manor is located in a temperate region and does not experience snow. The painting shows a specific style of snow visible in other regions of the game, most closely matching what is seen in the mountaintops of the Giants. Whether the Carian royal family had connections to that region, or whether the painting is simply atmospheric decoration, it represents a place outside of where it is displayed. 256. Blade's armor description references his being a shadow, created and bound to serve Ranni. The description uses the word bound in a specific context, noting that he was bound before choice was possible for him. Given that Blade is one of the most charming and apparently freely motivated characters in the game's cast, his armor description statement about the nature of his loyalty being not chosen but constructed is something that reframes every interaction with him in a specific way. 257. There is a door in the round table hold that rattles occasionally. The sound is subtle and occurs on a random timer. No NPC references the door. It cannot be opened and has no item associated with it. The rattling is the only indication that there is something beyond the door, and whether that something is supernatural, a cut NPC, or simply an ambient atmospheric sound is left entirely open. 258. The Erdtree's light has a specific effect on scarlet rot. In areas where the Erdtree's direct light falls, the rot does not spread. In Caelid, where the rot is strongest, the Erdtree's light reaches only filtered and distant. The geographic relationship between Erdtree light intensity and rot spread is consistent across all regions of the game, suggesting the Erdtree's light actively suppresses the rot. Given what the game reveals about the Golden Order's approach to the rot problem, the suppression rather than cure detail is significant. 259. There is a room in the eternal city of Nokron that has mirrors arranged in a semicircle facing inward. The mirrors face each other in a way that would create infinite reflections between them if there was something in the center to reflect. The center of the semicircle is empty. Whatever was meant to stand there and be reflected infinitely in those mirrors is gone, and the mirrors face each other across an absence. 260. The Round Table Hold exists outside the lands between in some metaphysical sense. Accessed through grace, players returning from far regions appear in the hold instantly. This property of the hold, of being accessible regardless of physical distance, is treated as functionally mundane by all the NPCs within it. They do not comment on the miracle of a space that is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The extraordinary is simply the condition of their existence there. 261. There is a specific animation that plays when you pick up an Elden Ring Grace, the golden item left by Grace sources. The animation is slightly different from the animation used to pick up regular items. The character reaches down more slowly and rises back up before the item is registered as collected. The additional beat in the animation was presumably added to make the moment of collecting Grace feel distinct from ordinary looting, and it succeeds at this while being nearly impossible to notice consciously. 262. The Halig tree is described as having been grown from a finger's worth of flesh from Miquella's body. The Halig tree is enormous. The scale implied by the description, an entire tree of that size from one finger's worth of material, suggests either that the growth involved something beyond ordinary biology, or that Miquella's flesh has properties that conventional understanding of biology does not account for. The tree, being the product of such a small origin, is one detail that the game uses to characterize Miquella's nature without requiring extensive exposition. 263. There is a tarnished body in the Altus Plateau that is holding a torch. The torch is still lit. The body is clearly dead. A lit torch in the hands of a dead tarnished is a small visual paradox, and how long the torch has been burning without going out, in the hands of someone who can no longer tend it, is a question the game lets sit, without resolution. 264. The knight's cavalry enemies appear only at night and ride specific patrol routes. Each knight's cavalry has a slightly different route that corresponds to the road or path it would have guarded in life. The routes make geographic sense as military patrol patterns for a living mounted guard, given the law that describes them as cursed to continue their patrol even after death. The route adherence is both law consistent and a piece of environmental storytelling about who they were before the curse. 265. There is a dog in Redmane Castle that is awake and hostile, but is positioned behind a barrier the player cannot pass through. The dog barks and reacts to the player but cannot reach them, and cannot be reached. It is simply there, on the other side of the barrier, for the duration of the player's time in that area. Whether this is an intentional environmental detail or an enemy placed in an area with unintended collision is ambiguous, but the specificity of its placement suggests it was at least noticed during development. 266. The Dragon Claw sorcery, which slams a spectral dragon claw onto the ground, has a shadow cast by the claw on the ground below. The shadow appears before the claw itself by a fraction of a second. This is not physically accurate. Light travels faster than sound, and a shadow should not precede its source. The shadow before claw detail may be a visual design choice to give the player a ground-level indication of where the impact will occur, functioning as a tells-based warning system embedded in the spell's visual design. 267. There is a tree in the Weeping Peninsula that has grown through the ruins of a building. The tree is of a variety found throughout Limgrave. The building stone has cracked and shifted to accommodate the tree's growth over what appears to be a very long time. The tree is healthy, the building is long abandoned. The tree's growth through the ruin is the most direct visual representation in the early game of how long the world's current state of disrepair has persisted. 268. The Round Table Hold's kitchen, accessible through a side corridor, contains fresh bread and food that has not spoiled. The hold is described as existing outside normal time in some respects. The fresh food is either being replenished by something or simply does not spoil in the hold's unusual temporal environment. Neither explanation is given. The bread is simply there and fresh, which is quietly surreal. 269. There is an illusory floor in the subterranean shunning grounds, distinct from the illusory walls used to hide rooms. The floor appears solid, Walking across it falls the player into an area below. The fall is survivable, but unexpected. The illusory floor is placed in a corridor that would otherwise be a dead end, so players who have exhausted other options and roll along the walls will eventually trigger it. It is the only illusory floor in the game, and it leads to the area that contains the path to the frenzied flame. 270. The Grail item, Dragon Heart, obtained by killing the sleeping dragon Grail, is described as the heart of the mother of all dragons in the region. Using a mother's heart as currency to learn dragon communion abilities is noted by no NPC. Gurunk, who might have something to say about dragons given his lore, does not comment. The transaction simply occurs, which is the game being deliberate about letting the player draw their own conclusions about what that transaction means. 271. There is a fountain in the Divine Tower of Limgrave's courtyard that shows signs of having been regularly used. The stone around the fountain's edge is smooth from contact in a way that unfrequented stone is not. Someone came to this fountain consistently enough over a long enough period to polish the stone. The tower itself, which was used to commune with the Erd Tree through the Great Runes, was presumably active with personnel for an extended period. The worn fountain is physical evidence of their daily presence. 272. The Carrion Grandeur sorcery, one of the most powerful close-range spells in the game, charges up in a way that is visually obscured. You can see the build-up happening from the enemy's perspective. The player character begins gathering magic, but you cannot see the extent of the build-up as the caster. The sorcery rewards commitment to the full charge, and the visual design makes that commitment feel like a leap of faith, because the caster cannot fully see what they are building toward. 273. There is a message on the ground near the site of grace at the top of the Divine Tower of Liurnia that reads, in player-created language, something approximating a warning about what will happen if you use the tower. The tower activates Ranni the Witch's power source in a way that has consequences for an NPC you may have met. The existence of this player warning in online mode represents the community transmitting knowledge about cause and effect in a world where the game does not explain consequences in advance. 274. There is a crow in the consecrated snowfield that drops an item called the Hero's Rune. When killed, the Hero's Rune description makes no reference to crows or to the snowfield. It describes a hero of unnamed origin. The crow's possession of this item is not explained. Crows in the game are associated with death and collection, and the possibility that this crow collected the rune from a battlefield or a burial site is consistent with their described behavior. 275. The Erd Tree burial watchdog enemies, which guard sites of loss or minor Erd Tree adjacent areas, come in two types. One uses fire, one uses magic. The choice of which type is present appears to correlate with what the specific site was used for in its active period. Sites associated with fire incantations have fire watchdogs. Sites associated with sorcery have magic ones. The correlation is consistent enough that it appears to be intentional. 276. There is a well in the Weeping Peninsula that, if you descend into it, leads to a small cave with a single ladder and no items at the bottom. The ladder at the bottom leads back up to the well. The well is a loop. Going down and coming back up with no reward or discovery is, by the logic of the game's reward systems, a waste of time. But someone put a ladder at the bottom of the well. The decision to include that detail, to make the well a complete space that could be explored even without a reward, is characteristic of the game's approach to world building as an end in itself. 277. The talisman, called Flock's Canvas Talisman, increases the potency of incantations. It is described as having been worn by a flock of birds. Whether birds wearing a talisman is literal in the game's world, and if so, what kind of birds and in what context is addressed nowhere. The image of a flock of birds, collectively wearing or passing around a magical talisman, is left to the imagination without any further scaffolding. 278. There is a body in the Ranni the Witch Academy that is still holding a glintstone staff. The staff is not collectible. The body died with the staff in hand, and both have been there long enough to become part of the environment. The staff is described in nearby context as a type used by senior members of the Academy. Finding a senior member's staff still gripped by a dead body in the Academy suggests this person's death was sudden and unexpected, rather than a retreat or surrender. 279. There is a ship visible on the horizon from certain coastal areas in Limgrave. The ship does not move. It is in the same position on every visit to those coastal areas. Whether it is a static environmental asset placed for atmosphere, a ship that has run aground far enough away that no movement is visible at that range, or the remains of something much larger that was destroyed. It is a feature of the Limgrave coastline that the game never addresses. 280. The flying dragon Agil, the dragon that attacks you in the dragon-burnt ruins of southern Limgrave, is the first major non-boss enemy the game throws at you in open exploration. Most players run from it the first time and return when stronger. When you kill Agil and look at the body, the detail of the scales and the wings is fully rendered at close range in a way that you cannot appreciate during the fight. There is a specific colour in the scales near the underbelly that is visible only from directly beneath the dragon after it has fallen. The dragon was modelled at full quality for close inspection of a model most players only ever see from a combat distance. 281. The Smithing Master Hugh's questline, if resolved, ends with him completing one specific weapon. The weapon he was working toward is connected to the broader narrative in a way that becomes clear only after a significant amount of other content is completed. His drive to complete this one weapon, despite everything, and the revelation of why he is driven to complete it, is one of the quest lines that rewards extreme completionism with genuine emotional weight. 282. There is an area in the Siofa River near the Spirit Spring that has a tree stump with what appears to be a child's toy resting on it. The toy is not an item, it cannot be collected, it sits on the stump, and that is all. Given the Siofa River's connection to the Eternal Cities and the lore around who lived in those cities, the presence of a child's toy in that location is a small and quiet indicator of the lives that were lived there before, whatever catastrophe made the Eternal City eternal. 283. The item called Remembrance of the Grafted, dropped by Godric, has a description that references Godric claiming the legacy of all who came before him through the act of grafting. The description uses language that implies Godric believed the grafting gave him genuine access to the power and history of those he took from. 1. Reading of the description suggests Godric was not simply a violent collector, but a person with a sincere and broken theory about how power is inherited. 284. There is a location in the mountain tops of the giants where multiple giant skeletons are visible, lying in positions that suggest they fell where they were standing. The giants described in the game's lore are cursed beings who cannot die. These skeletons represent giants who eventually died anyway. What killed them, given the described curse, is one of the open questions the game's lore deliberately leaves without a clean answer. 285. The Flask of Crimson Tears and the Flask of Cerulean Tears. The HP and FP recovery flasks have descriptions that reference tears shed by the Erd tree. The word tears is doing double duty here, both the fluid of crying and the substance of tearing apart. And whether the Erd tree wept these, or they are the product of the Erd tree being torn apart, is not specified. The language is ambiguous, in a way that suggests both meanings apply simultaneously. 286. There is a chair in the Rea Lucaria debate parlour that is being pushed back from the table at an angle, as if someone stood up suddenly from it. Every other chair in the room is aligned to the table. This one was left in the position of an abrupt departure. Given the context of the Academy's internal conflicts, the specificity of the chair's position reads as a snapshot of a moment when something happened here that ended a conversation very quickly. 287. The full armor set of the Crucible Knight has item descriptions that read in sequence, tell the history of the Crucible more coherently than almost any single item or NPC dialogue does. The set is designed so that someone who picks it up and reads all 4 descriptions in sequence has a better understanding of the Crucible's cosmological role than someone who reads only 1 or 2. The information architecture of the armor set is deliberate. 288. There is a body at the base of the Erd tree's outer wall that has been there long enough that grass has grown around it. The grass has not grown over the body itself. The outline of the body is maintained as a gap in the grass, as if the ground beneath recognizes the shape. Whether this is an environmental detail built into the game's grass generation system, or a specific hand-placed grass arrangement around the body model is unclear. 289. The Dragon Communion Cathedral on the offshore island in Limgrave is accessible at the beginning of the game, but requires navigating around or through significant obstacles. The players who find it early are treated to Dragon Communion abilities very early in their progression. The cathedral's placement, technically accessible from the start, but practically challenging, is consistent with the game's broader design philosophy of allowing everything to be explored in theory, while discouraging it through environmental difficulty. 290. There is an area of the Siofra River where the ceiling of the cave is so high that it disappears into darkness, and the darkness above has stars in it. Standing at the bottom of an underground cave and looking up at a star field that should not be visible from underground, and then recognizing that the eternal cities were described as having a relationship with stars that the surface world did not have, produces a specific feeling that the game's designers were clearly aiming for. 291. The Ul Palace ruins, located in the Ainsel River area, contain evidence of a sophisticated culture, including what appears to be the remnants of public gathering spaces and civic architecture. The ruins suggest a city that was organized around collective activity rather than purely hierarchical or religious functions. This distinction from the other underground eternal city architecture makes Ul Palace ruins feel like a different kind of place, and the lore of who built it points toward a people who organized themselves in ways distinct from the Golden Order's model. 292. There is a specific flower visible growing between the stones of a wall in Stormvale Castle that is of a variety not native to that region. The flower matches varieties found much further south in the Weeping Peninsula. Its presence in Stormvale suggests it was either brought there deliberately or arrived as a seed carried from the south by a person or an animal. The flower is alive and blooming, which means it found the conditions of the castle wall hospitable. 293. The Remembrance of the Fire Giant, when read, describes a giant who was the last of his kind, kept alive specifically to maintain the flame of ruin as a tool for someone else's purpose. He was the last survivor of his entire people and was kept as a piece of infrastructure. The item description phrasing does not editorialize. It simply states this. The absence of commentary in the description on the horror of the situation is itself a form of commentary. 294. There is a tree in the consecrated snowfield that has prayer beads hanging from its branches. The beads are the same visual design as the cracked pot items and the perfume bottle items used in crafting. Whether the beads are a form of offering, a marker, or simply a detail placed for atmosphere, their presence on a tree in an otherwise desolate snowfield suggests someone visits this tree or visited it in the past with enough regularity to decorate it. 295. The item description for the Lord's Rune, the highest value great rune obtained from bosses, describes it as condensed grace at such a high density that it becomes dangerous to ordinary beings. Only the Tarnished can safely handle it. Given that the Tarnished are described throughout the game as beings for whom grace has returned after a long absence, the implication that their grace affinity allows them to handle what would harm others is a quiet elevation of the player character that most item descriptions do not directly make. 296. There is a sleeping stone digger troll in the Altus Plateau that does not have the same aggression radius as the waking trolls nearby. It can be approached very closely before it wakes. When it does wake, its first animation is a stretch, the same stretch animation used by smaller animals like dogs when they wake from sleep in the game world. The choice to give a large threatening enemy the same waking animation as domestic animals is a small humanizing detail for a creature with limited characterization. 297. The teardrop scarab enemies, which are iridescent beetles that carry items on their backs, move in patterns that suggest they are following something invisible. Their paths are curved rather than straight, and they turn at regular intervals as if following a line. In some locations, the path of a teardrop scarab, if mapped, coincides with the path of a site of Grace's golden light as it reaches across terrain. Whether the scarabs are following Grace or whether their paths intersect with Grace paths for a different reason is not established. 298. There is a brazier in the Mogwin Palace area that burns with a flame that is visually identical to the flame of frenzy, despite being in an area associated with a completely different form of power. The Mogwin Palace is associated with Mog and with blood magic. The frenzied flame's visual presence in a brazier. There is either an environmental design asset reuse without intentional lore significance, or a detail suggesting a connection between the two forms of power that is not addressed elsewhere. 299. The giant crusher weapon, mentioned earlier for its straightforward item description, has a specific gravity property in combat. If you use it on an elevated surface and the enemy you hit is near the edge, the knockback from the weapon is significantly more effective than on flat ground. This environmental interaction is built into the physics of the weapon's knockback, rather than being a special mechanic. Players who discover it have found that the giant crusher's design philosophy extends beyond description to a physics system that treats its weight with consistency. 300. There is a view from the top of the Divine Tower of East Altus, accessible during Morgoth's questline, and afterward, that encompasses a remarkable portion of the game world. On a clear in-game day, you can see Lanedell to the west, the mountain tops to the north, and the edge of Caelid's red haze to the east. The tower was presumably used for observation before the shattering. The perspective from its top is one of the few moments in the game where the geography of the world is organized and visible in a way that maps directly to the player's accumulated experience of traveling through it. 301. The glintstone sorceries as a category have an internal logic visible across their item descriptions. Early sorceries are described in terms of their technical mechanism. Advanced sorceries are described in terms of their philosophical implications. The progression from technical to philosophical in the item description language mirrors how actual academic fields develop, moving from empirical description toward theoretical interpretation as the field matures. 302. There is a dog in the Altus Plateau near one of the patrol routes of an ancient dragon that is alive but has clearly been injured. It limps on 3 legs. It is not hostile. It will flee if approached. Given that the ancient dragon's route passes directly through this area, the dog's injury and its survival near such a dangerous creature raises questions about what happened to it that the game does not answer. 303. The living jar enemies, when they explode, leave behind a pile of ash and bone fragments. The fragments include small skull pieces. Given the item description of living jars as containing the remains of warrior burials, the skull fragments visible after their death are the same individuals whose remains filled the jar during its construction. The visual of what is inside them is only visible after they are destroyed, which is when you can no longer examine it. 304. There is a section of the mountain tops of the Giants where the wind is loud enough to partially drown out the game's music. The music does not stop. It continues at full volume in the audio mix. But the environmental wind is also at full volume, creating a layered soundscape in which the music is present but partially obscured. The interplay between diegetic sound design and non-diegetic score in this area is one of the more unusual audio decisions in the game. 305. The Star Scourge Radahn boss fight is noted among From Software fans as one of the most visually spectacular fights in the studio's catalogue. Less noted is the behavior of the summoned NPCs during the fight. Each NPC has a survival instinct. They retreat when their health is low. They advance when Radahn is vulnerable. They prioritize specific attack windows. The AI behavior of the NPC summons during the Radahn fight received more complexity than most enemy AI in the game, and it is visible if you watch them carefully rather than focusing entirely on Radahn. 306. There is a trail of oil in the Volcano Manor that leads from a corridor into a room that does not contain anything remarkable. The oil trail looks as though it has been dripping from something being moved, or from someone who was leaking oil as they walked. The trail starts in a room and ends at the wall of another, which either means the source of the oil went through the wall, or the trail begins at a point that was once accessible and is no longer. 307. The magma worm Makar boss, who appears in the ruin-strewn precipice dungeon, is notable for being a dragon-type enemy that uses a weapon. Magma worms in general use their bodies as weapons. Makar specifically was given a curved greatsword. The item description of the sword notes Makar found it, which means a dragon picked up a human weapon, held onto it and to its fighting style. This is either a behavioral detail pointing toward magma worms having more cognitive complexity than typical animals, or it is Makar being a specific individual with individual characteristics that others of his kind do not share. 308. There is a fireplace in the Stormvale banquet hall that still has the remains of a fire that has recently burned out. The ash in the fireplace is fresh, meaning it has not weathered or settled the way long cold ash does. Someone had a fire in this fireplace not very long before the player arrived. Given that the banquet hall is otherwise abandoned, whoever lit that fire was there recently and departed. 309. The Erd Tree avatar in Caelid, which guards a minor Erd Tree that is visibly dying, has a visual state that differs from other Erd Tree avatars. Its body appears partially consumed by the scarlet rot. The golden tone of its form is mottled with patches of red-orange. The avatar is not immune to the rot, and the dying minor Erd Tree it guards has begun to affect it. The boss fight against this avatar is thematically different from others, because you are not fighting a guardian at full strength. You are fighting something that is already being consumed. 310. There is a room in the deep-root depths, the area accessed from the subterranean shunning grounds through a series of drops, that contains a miniature city model. The model is not explained by any item description or NPC. It appears to be a detailed scale representation of a city that does not match any accessible location in the game. The detail level of the miniature, including tiny roads and structures, suggests it was placed with intentional care rather than as a throwaway environmental asset. 311. The Crimson Flask's name, Flask of Crimson Tears, contains a word that appears in multiple contexts in the game's lore. Tears are referenced in the Round Table Hold's design, in the cosmology of the Erd Tree's origins, and in Miquella's personal story. The word carries weight across contexts in a way that makes the mundane healing flask feel embedded in a much larger symbolic system, even though its function is as simple as drinking to recover health. 312. There is a merchant in the Siofra River area who is the only merchant in the game's underground regions. The merchant's presence underground raises questions about how they got there, how long they have been there, and what their supply chain looks like. The merchant's dialogue, which is slightly different in tone from the surface merchants, hints at having been underground for a very long time. None of these questions are answered directly. 313. The Cleanrot Armor's helmet has a visor design that is inspired by real historical helmet visor designs, but exaggerated in its proportions in a way that is specific to this set. The exaggeration appears in the cheek guard extensions, which are longer than functional necessity would require. One reading is that the extended cheek guards are protective against the downward flowing scarlet rot that Malenia's forces would be exposed to, catching drips before they could enter the visor. 314. There is a sorcery called Founding Rain of Stars that calls down stars from above. Its item description references it as having been used in a time before the Erd Tree, when the relationship between the people of the lands between and the cosmos was different. Using this sorcery in the current era, which is organized entirely around the Erd Tree's power, carries an implicit anachronism. You are wielding a practice from a different age, and the game's cosmology suggests that age and the current one understood divine power in fundamentally different terms. 315. There is an abandoned camp in eastern Limgrave, near the border of Caelid, that shows signs of rot exposure. Boxes and equipment have the telltale scarlet discoloration, but the camp was not overrun. There is no violence visible. The people who were here packed up some things and left others. The suggestion is that they could see or smell what was coming and made a choice to leave while they could. 316. The Dragon Lord Placidusac's boss, accessed through a very specific lying down interaction in a particular location in Farum Azula, has two heads, or rather, it has skulls where two heads used to be, and a central body that has grown a new head in their place. The item lore suggests Placidusax once had a god, and lost that god, and the absent heads may represent a before state of the creature. Whatever Placidusax was before his god was lost, he was something different from what you fight. 317. There is a room in the Divine Tower of West Altus that has writing on the walls. The writing is in the game's fabricated script and has not been fully translated in community efforts. The density of the writing, covering large sections of multiple walls, suggests this room was used for documentation or record keeping rather than ceremony or storage. In a tower whose other rooms are more obviously functional, a room filled with dense writing has a different kind of purpose. 318. The Cleanrot Knight that drops the Halo Scythe weapon has a specific patrol path that moves through an area of the Halig tree where the Scarlet Rot is least concentrated. Whether this individual knight was stationed there because of the lower rot concentration, or whether the lower rot in that area is a result of this knight's extended presence, is a chicken and egg question the game does not resolve. 319. There is a tower in the Liurnia region that is occupied by one enemy, a Carian knight, who patrols its single interior room. The knight does not patrol outside the room. It does not react to sounds from the tower's exterior. It simply moves back and forth in its room. The knight is protecting nothing visible. The room it patrols has no items. The dedication of this specific enemy to this specific empty space is a detail that raises more questions than the game is interested in answering. 320. The Azure and Lusat sorceries, named after the two primeval sorcerers, have descriptions that frame both men as heretics. Heresy in the game's world is defined by the Golden Order, which determines legitimate practice. The sorceries themselves, which are the most powerful in their categories, are heretical not because they are evil, but because they access sources of power the Golden Order has not sanctioned. The most powerful tools in the sorcery school are the forbidden ones, which is a consistent theme across the game's approach to power. 321. There is a detail in the visual effect of the Sacred Relic Sword's weapon art that shows golden rings expanding outward from the impact point. The rings are arranged at distances that match the described range of the attack. If you count the rings, there are exactly as many as the number of targets the weapon art can hit in optimal conditions. The visual design of the attack's range indicator is built into the art's aesthetic rather than being a separate UI element. 322. There is a tibia marina in the mountaintops of the giants that summons skeletal militiamen. The militiamen in this specific encounter wear armor that has a different insignia from the skeletal militiamen found in other locations. The insignia matches lore-referenced armor from the era of the Fire Giants' conflict with Marika's army. The tibia marina in the mountaintops may be summoning the actual dead from that specific battle, rather than generic skeletal soldiers. 323. There is a window in the Elden Throne, the room where you fight Radagon and the Elden Beast. That shows the outside world. The window shows a burning and changed landscape compared to what the player has experienced navigating to the throne. Whether this window looks into the future of what the Elden Beast's defeat will produce, or whether it reflects the current state of the world that the player has not yet seen from this angle, is a question that the ending cutscenes address in ways that are still debated. 324. The item called Lost Ashes of War, which can be used to duplicate Ashes of War techniques, is described as having been found where warriors gathered to perfect their craft. The plural of the finding location suggests these training grounds existed as a formalized institution. Finding the lost ashes in areas that do not resemble training grounds in the current game world implies those grounds are gone. The infrastructure that produced the ashes has been destroyed, and what remains are the residual techniques, separated from the context that produced them. 325. There is a giant's finger used as a bridge in the mountain tops of the giants. The finger is large enough to serve this purpose, and players walk across it as a legitimate path. The act of crossing a giant severed finger, as if it were a natural piece of the landscape, is made unremarkable by the game's presentation. No prompt appears, no special animation plays. You simply walk across the finger and continue. 326. The Halig Tree Crest Great Shield has a depiction of the Halig Tree on its face. The tree on the shield is depicted as fully healthy, with full foliage and golden coloration. The actual Halig Tree visible in the game is withered and partially corrupted by the scarlet rot. The shield was made at a time when the Halig Tree was in a different state than it is when you access it, and the contrast between the shield's image and the reality of the tree is visible if you encounter the shield before or after exploring the Halig Tree. 327. There is a room in Raya Lucaria, accessible through the roof rather than through any door, which requires an unconventional approach over the rooftops. The room is an office, with bookshelves and a desk. The desk has items on it, arranged in a specific order, more organized than the debris in surrounding rooms. This room was preserved from the Academy's conflicts, and someone used it regularly enough to maintain its organization. Given the route required to reach it, only someone who knew the rooftop path would have had access. 328. The Malenia, Blade of Miquella boss title, is the only boss title in the game that defines a person by their relationship to someone else. Every other boss is identified by their own title or name. Malenia is identified as Miquella's blade. Given everything the game reveals about Malenia's extraordinary power and the lengths she has gone to, defining her in relation to Miquella says something about how she sees herself, which is ultimately in service to someone she loves. 329. There is a bird's nest in the church of Elie ruins that contains 2 eggs. The eggs are a different colour from the eggs found in the nest in Stormvale Castle mentioned earlier. The colour difference between these eggs and the Stormvale ones suggests they belong to different bird species. The game includes this level of biological specificity in purely decorative environmental details, placed in locations most players look at for less than a second. 330. The rot grease item, which adds scarlet rot build-up to weapons, has a description that notes it was developed by fighters who faced rot using enemies and needed to return the condition in kind. The moral framing of the item description, which presents rot as a counter-tactic rather than something inherently evil, is characteristic of the game's approach to alignment. Rot is terrible in the game's world. It is also a technique, and techniques are used by whoever finds them useful. 331. There is a section of the Ainsel River where 2 rivers merge. The merging point creates a visual effect of the 2 currents meeting and swirling before settling into the main channel downstream. Fluid simulation of this quality. For an underground river in a game segment most players move through without pausing is the kind of detail that exists because someone on the environmental art team thought it should be there. 332. The item description for Radahn's Redmane helm references his keeping his long hair under the helmet. Radahn in his boss fight has hair visible where his helmet does not fully cover it. The matching between the item description detail and the visual model detail is an example of the game's consistency between text and visual representation that rewards players who read carefully. 333. There is a painting, accessible through the Painter questline, that depicts a sunset location in the Altus Plateau. If you find the location the painting depicts and travel there, you find a person sitting and watching the view. This specific reward for having sought out the painting's location is one of the quieter moments in the game, and it rewards curiosity without adding combat or loot as the primary discovery. The person at the location is the painter herself. 334. The Radahn festival triggered during his questline has a dialogue from Jeren, the event host, that changes depending on what point in the festival you speak to him. Early in the festival, he is celebratory. After Radahn is defeated, he is quieter. If you progress Jeren's own questline, his final state at the festival reflects what has happened to him personally, not just the conclusion of the event. The same location and the same NPC registers different emotional states depending on your progress through multiple questlines simultaneously. 335. There is a larval tier in the Altus Plateau that is inside the body of a rolling stone enemy that you must kill to collect. The rolling stone appears to be a regular boulder until it reveals the enemy beneath. The larval tear, being hidden inside a shape-shifting enemy, is an appropriate location for an item used for transformation, and it is one of many cases in the game where item placement reflects the item's function. 336. The item description for Rykard's Great Rune references his desire to devour the gods as a continuation of something rather than a new plan. The description implies this idea existed before Rykard, that consuming the divine as a form of gaining power is a practice or tradition he is continuing rather than inventing. What tradition that is, and who else practiced it before Rykard, is not elaborated upon. 337. There is a fountain in the Lanedell outer area that has been converted into a fire pit. The fountain basin,